You arrive at a small timber-framed cottage, standing in a quiet clearing deep within the Black Forest, where the trees lean close on all sides, but leave just enough open ground for a patch of weak sunlight to reach the mossy roof. The building itself is old and weathered, its dark wooden beams set into a lattice of wattle and daub that has been patched in a dozen places over the years with fresh clay and straw, each mend blending softly into the next until the whole wall has the look of a faded, much-mended garment. The roof is steep and thatched with long bundles of rye straw, their ends cut clean along the eaves, though here and there a wisp has pulled loose to tremble in the breeze, and the ridgeline dips ever so slightly in the middle where the heavy timber frame has settled into the earth over the course of many winters. A single chimney rises from the far side, built of rough fieldstones stacked without mortar in the old manner, and from its mouth a thin wisp of grey smoke unspools itself continually, drifting upward in a lazy column that flattens and frays as it meets the cooler air above the clearing. The land around the cottage has been cleared of undergrowth, but not tamed, so tufts of wild grass and clusters of fern grow right up to the doorstep, and a few stumps of ancient firs still dot the open space, their surfaces softened by a thick coat of emerald moss. A narrow path of packed earth leads out of the clearing and vanishes between the dark trunks of the surrounding forest, while a second, fainter track branches off toward the sound of a stream that you can hear but not yet see, a constant low murmur of water moving over stones somewhere beyond the tree line. As you stand for a moment in this clearing, the quality of the light becomes apparent, a soft pewter glow that filters down through the canopy of fir and beech, losing much of its brightness before it touches the ground. In the early morning, this light has a silvery cast that turns the straw of the roof to pale gold and deepens the shadows beneath the eaves into pools of charcoal grey, while by midday the sun may climb high enough to strike the clearing directly for an hour or two, revealing a surprisingly rich palette of greens and browns in the moss, the thatch, the old wood, the air is cool and still, carrying the mineral breath of the forest, damp earth and leaf mold balanced by the sharper, cleaner scent of the firs, and underneath these a faint, pervasive smokiness from the chimney that never quite dissipates. Occasionally a bird calls from somewhere deep in the trees, a single clear note that hangs in the silence for a moment before fading, and then the quiet reassembles itself as if the sound had never been. The cottage is flanked on one side by a small garden patch enclosed with a low wattle fence of woven hazel branches, where neat rows of root vegetables have been planted in raised beds of dark, crumbly soil. Carrots whose feathery tops shiver in the breeze, turnips with their broad, rough leaves, a stand of leeks pushing up through a mulch of straw. A few herbs grow closer to the cottage wall, rosemary and thyme and a single woody sage bush, their scents released in faint puffs whenever you brush against them. The garden is orderly, but not austere, and a watering can made of beaten copper rests beside the fence, its surface green with verdigris, catching the occasional drip from a leak in its seam. Beyond the garden, attached to the cottage by a short covered passageway, stands a workshed that is little more than a lean-to built against the main wall, its roof sloping downward at a gentler angle than the thatch above, and its front entirely open to the air. Inside this shed, you can make out the shapes of a large sauce, a stack of thin beechwood strips laid flat between battens to keep them from warping, and several bundles of something pale and fibrous hanging from the rafters like bundles of coarse hair, which in fact they are. Now turning toward the cottage door, which is a single slab of oak hung on heavy iron hinges that have gone nearly black with age, you notice the small details that speak of a life lived slowly and with care. The door handle worn smooth by countless hands, the stone threshold slightly hollowed in the middle where generations of boots have scraped their soles, the cluster of drying herbs tied with twine and nailed to the lintel to ward off moths and damp. The door opens inward without a sound, its edges fitted carefully into a frame that has been kept true over the years with wedges and a little beeswax, and as you step inside, the quality of the air changes at once. It is warmer here, held close by the thick walls and the low ceiling, and it carries a different blend of smells: wood smoke from the hearth, the dry grassy scent of hanging horsehair, the faint sweetness of beeswax from the workbench, and the good plain odour of a room that is swept daily and aired when the weather allows. The main room of the cottage is not large, but feels comfortable in its proportions. The ceiling low enough that a tall person would have to stoop, its exposed beams darkened by smoke and time until they are nearly black against the whitewashed plaster of the walls. A single window is set into the western wall, its panes of thick, bubbled glass held in a lattice of lead strips that divide the view into small, irregular sections, each one distorting the green of the forest beyond into a soft, wavering abstraction. The glass is old and full of tiny imperfections, small seeds of trapped air and wavy ripples that catch the light in unexpected ways, so that as the sun moves across the sky, the panes shift from clear to milky to a pale amber that spills across the floorboards in elongated shapes. Directly beneath this window stands the workbench, which is the true heart of the room, a heavy slab of beech timber supported on 4 sturdy legs that have been pegged and braced so solidly that the whole assembly feels as permanent as the cottage itself. The surface of the bench is worn smooth as silk by generations of hands and tools, its grain raised slightly in some places and polished flat in others, and scattered across it now in a careful arrangement are the tools of the sieve maker's trade. A small wooden mallet with a head darkened by use, a set of draw plates each drilled with a row of diminishing holes, a curved awl with a handle of polished boxwood, a spool of thin linen thread, a pair of iron shears, and a shallow clay bowl filled soft and beeswets that honeyed Bet. Along one wall of the room, stacked neatly on open shelves made from planks of rough pine, are the materials and half-finished pieces that mark the rhythm of the work. Here are bundles of raw horsehair tied with strands of simple string, the hair itself varying in color from a pale honey blonde to a deep glossy brown, and even a few strands of striking black that the sieve maker sets aside for the finest work. Beside these are wooden sieve frames in various stages of completion, some still in flat strips waiting to be bent and shaped, others already formed into smooth circles and sanded to a fine finish, and a few that have been woven with mesh and are now waiting only for their outer rims to be fixed into place. The mesh in these finished sieves catches the light from the window and glimmers faintly, each tiny square opening so regular and precise that it seems almost impossible for human hands to have made it. Higher shelves hold a few simple household items, a pewter plate, a wooden bowl, a horn spoon, a small sack of rye flour closed with a wooden toggle, while from the ceiling beams hang several linen bags stuffed with sorted hair, each one labelled with a scrap of birch tied on with twine and marked with a single charcoal stroke indicating the grade. The hearth is set into the opposite wall, a large open fireplace built of the same grey fieldstone as the chimney outside, with a deep recess where a small log fire burns steadily. Its flames are soft orange that rarely rise higher than a hand's width above the wood. A cast iron pot hangs from an adjustable hook over the embers, and inside it a simple broth of root vegetables and barley simmers with a gentle, rhythmic bubbling that you can hear only if you stand quite still. The fire does not crackle loudly, for the wood used is well-seasoned beech that burns slowly and quietly, giving off a steady warmth that spreads through the room and seeps into the walls. On a stone ledge beside the fire rests a single tallow candle in a simple iron holder, unlit for now because the daylight is sufficient, but ready for the evening when the shadows will deepen and the small flame will become the only source of light besides the glowing embers. A low wooden settle stands near the hearth, its seat padded with a folded wool blanket that has been patched in several places with neat, tiny stitches, and a pair of wooden clogs are tucked underneath. In the far corner, partially hidden by a simple curtain of unbleached linen strung on a rod, there is a low bed, built into a recess in the wall, its straw mattress covered with a coarse wool blanket, and a single pillow stuffed with goose feathers that smell faintly of lavender from the sprigs tucked into the ticking. The bed is made neatly, the blanket tucked in at the corners, and the whole alcove has the air of a quiet, protected place where sleep comes with no effort at all. Standing in this room, you begin to notice how every object has its place and every surface its purpose. The broom leaning against the wall by the door is made of bundled birch twigs bound tightly with willow bark, its handle worn to a smooth, dark patina from years of morning sweeping. The water bucket on a low stool near the door is wooden, its staves held by copper bands that have aged to a dull green, and the dipper carved from a single piece of lime wood floats on the surface of the water within. Even the dust motes that drift lazily through the shaft of light from the window seem to move with a slow, deliberate quality, as if they too are part of the quiet order of the place. The room is not silent, but the sounds it holds are all gentle and uninsistent. The low murmur of the fire, the occasional soft tick of cooling metal from the hearth, the distant whisper of the stream that you can still hear through the walls, and the faint, papery rustle of the hanging horsehair whenever the air stirs just enough to move it. Outside, beyond the window, the forest continues its own quiet life. The rustle of leaves, the creak of a branch, the call of a bird, all of it absorbed into the deep, patient stillness that lies over the clearing like a blanket. The cottage has no clock except the sun and the seasons, but time here is measured in other ways, in the gradual shift of the light across the floorboards, in the steady consumption of the log in the hearth, in the number of sieve rims stacked and waiting, in the bundles of hair yet to be sorted. The sieve maker who lives here works by this slow, natural clock, rising when the light returns, resting when the light fails, and filling the hours between with the careful, repetitive tasks that give shape to the days. The room you are standing in is both a home and a workshop. Yet the two functions blend so seamlessly that it is hard to say where domestic life ends and craft begins. The same hands that stir the pot over the fire will later thread a horsehair through a drawer plate, and the same patience that guides the weaving of a fine mesh will later bank the hearth for the night. Everything here is connected in a quiet, unbroken circle, and the cottage has held this pattern for so long that the very walls seem steeped in it. As your eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside, you notice the texture of the plaster on the walls, which is not perfectly smooth, but bears the faint marks of the trowel that spread it, subtle ripples and ridges that catch the low light and give the surface a gentle, organic quality. A single shelf above the workbench holds a few small personal items that are so worn and ordinary as to be almost invisible. A smooth river stone used as a weight for holding down corners of linen, a fragment of a broken clay pipe that serves as a holder for oar tips, a small wooden box with a sliding lid that contains a few copper coins and a spare button carved from horn. There are no pictures on the walls, no decorations, nothing that is not directly useful, yet the room is not barren or cold. The warmth of the wood, the softness of the woolen blanket, the golden glow of the fire, and the gentle disorder of the workbench all combine to create a feeling of deep, settled comfort. It is a place designed not for show, but for living and working slowly, day after day, in a rhythm that has remained unchanged for many years. Now, if you were to step back outside and look at the cottage from the edge of the clearing, you would see how perfectly it fits into its setting. The thatch is taken on a patina of moss and lichen, in shades of sage and rust, so that from a distance the roof seems to grow out of the ground like a natural feature of the landscape. The timbers of the frame have weathered to a silvery grey that matches the bark of the firs, and the smoke rising from the chimney is often the only sign of human presence for miles around. The forest presses in on all sides, a dark, shaggy wall of conifers and ancient beeches whose branches interlace overhead. But the clearing itself remains open and calm, a small pocket of domesticated space held gently in the vast, quiet wilderness. The stream you heard earlier runs perhaps 100 paces to the east, a shallow, quick-flowing watercourse that tumbles over a bed of smooth stones and fallen branches, its voice a constant, soothing presence that rises and falls with the wind, but never entirely disappears. In the winter, when the trees are bare, you might see a little farther into the woods, catching glimpses of deer trails and the brown carpet of fallen leaves. But in the summer, the foliage closes in so thickly that the cottage feels entirely alone, a small island of human craft in a green sea of forest. Yet this isolation is not a lonely one. It is simply a fact of the landscape, as natural as the stream or the trees, and the cottage has stood here in this clearing for so long that the forest has grown around it without complaint. Returning once more inside, the sense of quiet envelops you again, and you might find yourself drawn to the workbench by the window, where the sieve maker's tools wait in their orderly arrangement. The surface of the beech slab is not only smooth but slightly hollowed in the center, a shallow concavity that has been worn down over decades by the repeated pressure of hands and the friction of materials pushed back and forth, and this depression is so gradual that you would not notice it unless you ran your palm flat across the wood. The light falling through the window panes throws a faint, wavering pattern onto the bench, distorted by the bubbles and ripples in the glass, so that a single beam becomes a dappled, shifting design of light and shadow that moves almost imperceptibly as the sun travels its arc. The horsehair bundles on the shelves catch this light and glow softly, the pale strands seeming almost luminous, the dark ones absorbing the glow and holding it deep within their fibers. Everything in the room seems poised in a state of patient waiting, the tools ready, the materials at hand, the fire murmuring quietly to itself, all of it prepared for the slow work that will begin again tomorrow, or later today, or whenever the sieve maker feels the quiet pull of the craft. And so the cottage in its forest clearing settles into the gentle, endless rhythm of its days, a rhythm that is carried on like the turning of a water wheel or the breathing of the trees. Steady, constant, and so calm that even to stand in this room is to feel your own heart beat slow, your thoughts grow soft and distant, and the weight of the world outside dissolve into the deep, quiet peace of the black forest. Far from the forest clearing, down where the land softens into valleys and the rivers run slower through broad meadows, the horsehair begins its journey in the stables and farmyards that supply the sieve maker's cottage. These are not grand estates, but modest, working holdings where sturdy draft horses spend their days pulling ploughs, hauling carts of hay and timber, or turning the heavy millstones that grind the valley's grain. The stables are long, low buildings of stone and timber, their roofs tiled with red clay or thatched in the same manner as the cottage, and inside the air is thick with the sweet, warm scent of hay and the earthy musk of horses. The floors are laid with straw that rustles constantly as the animals shift their weight, and the light enters through narrow, unglazed windows that admit slanted shafts of sunshine filled with drifting chaff, while outside swallows dart beneath the eaves and the sound of harness bells drifts on the air. It is here, in the daily routine of grooming and care, that the raw material of the sieve is gathered, one handful of hair at a time. Stable hands, who know each horse by name and temperament, move among the stalls with wooden curry combs and stiff brushes, their movements slow and practiced from years of repetition. The horses stand patiently, their great bodies warm and solid, occasionally stamping a heavy hoof or blowing a long breath through soft nostrils as the grooming proceeds. As the brush passes down a tail, it catches the long, coarse strands that have loosened and pulls them free, gathering them into a mixture of dirt and fine underhair that must later be separated. The stable hands collect these tail and mane trimmings in coarse linen sacks hung from hooks on the stall posts, each sack marked with the name of the horse and the date, because the sieve maker prefers hair sorted by animal when possible, believing that uniformity of texture makes for a finer mesh. Not all hair is kept, however, for the sieve maker requires only the longest, straightest, most resilient strands, those that can span the width of a sieve frame without breaking and hold their tension through years of use. So the stable hands sort as they gather. They run their fingers through each handful, feeling for the wiry, springy quality that marks good hair, discarding the short, snapped pieces and the softer, fluffier, down into a separate bin for stuffing cushions or making rough twine. The chosen strands, pale blonde or rich brown or occasionally a deep gleaming black from a Percheron or a particularly fine Belgian, are laid in a wooden box lined with clean cloth, and when the box is full, its contents are transferred to a larger basket where the hair lies in a loose, shimmering tangle that catches the light like threads of spun glass. The work of gathering enough hair for even a single sieve is slow, for a horse yields only a small amount of usable hair each grooming session, and the sieve maker's order requires many hundreds of strands for a batch of sieves. So the gathering stretches over weeks, the stable hands adding a few locks each morning and evening to the growing collection, and the basket fills gradually with a soft, fibrous mass that smells faintly of horse and the clover-scented liniment rubbed into the animals' coats. The hair is not yet clean, carrying with it a fine dust of dried mud and the natural oils of the horse's skin. But already one can see the potential in its length and luster, the way a single strand drawn out to its full extent shimmers, with a natural curve that will straighten under tension and spring back when released. Children sometimes help with the sorting, sitting on upturned buckets in the stable yard and picking through the day's gleanings to remove the last bits of hay and straw that cling to the hair. their small fingers patient and precise in the sunny warmth, while the horses doze in the paddock and the pigeons coo on the ridge of the barn roof. When a sufficient quantity has been gathered, the hair is taken to the washing place, a shallow, clear stream that runs along the edge of the village common, where a flat rock has been set into the bank to serve as a washing board, and a simple wooden frame holds the stretched netting for drying. The washing itself is a gentle, unhurried process that begins early in the morning when the stream water is coldest and cleanest, before any livestock have stirred the sediment upstream. The stable hands submerge the bundles of hair in the running water, holding them down with smooth stones to let the current flow through the fibers, carrying away the dust and the looser particles of dirt without tangling the strands. After a long soak, each bundle is lifted and laid on the flat rock, worked gently with a cake of simple brown soap made from wood ash and tallow, and then rinsed again in the clear water until the soap bubbles run away downstream and the hair squeaks faintly under the fingers when pinched. The washed hair is then spread out on the drying netting in thin layers, the strands aligned as much as possible by hand, so that they will dry straight and parallel, a task that requires patience and a steady eye, because the damp hair clings together and must be teased apart, strand by strand. The sun does the rest, warming the netting and drawing the moisture out over the course of a long morning, while a light breeze rustles the hair and gives it a faint, clean scent of water and fresh air. By midday, the hair is dry to the touch, its natural oils somewhat reduced but not stripped away entirely, leaving it with a soft sheen and a supple strength, ready for the next stage of its preparation. Once dry, the hair is gathered from the netting in large handfuls and brought to a shaded work table under an open-sided shed, where the final sorting and bundling takes place. Here, in the cool dimness, the hair is laid out and inspected in good light from the open sides, each strand drawn between thumb and forefinger to test its thickness and uniformity. The sorter, who might be the same stable hand who gathered the hair or an older farm worker whose hands are too stiff for heavier labor, separates the hair into 3 grades. The longest, thickest, and most resilient strands go into a bundle destined for the warp of the sieve, those load-bearing vertical lines that must withstand the constant tension of the loom and the later pressure of sifting. Slightly finer hairs, still long and straight but a shade less robust, are set aside for the weft, which will pass over and under the warp and must be flexible enough to bend without kinking. Any strands that are beautifully long but unusually fine, almost silky to the touch, are kept apart in a small special hank, for these will be used to weave the finest mesh sieves that millers require for sifting the most delicate flour. The sorting is a quiet, meditative task, the only sounds the rustle of hair on the wooden tabletop and the distant lowing of cattle in the meadow, and it is done with the same unhurried care that governs every step of the process, because a poorly sorted bundle will lead to an uneven mesh that no miller would accept. The graded hair is then bundled into neat hanks, each one a uniform handful that is drawn out to its full length, doubled over once, and tied with a loop of simple twine at the folded end. The bundle maker's hands work in a steady rhythm, drawing the hair through the fingers to align the strands, smoothing down any flyaways, and twisting the twine with a quick, practiced motion that results in a compact, tidy packet that can be stored and transported without tangling. A dozen such hanks of warp hair might be tied together with a longer cord, and another dozen of weft hair beside them, while the special fine hank is wrapped separately in a piece of clean linen to protect it from dust. The completed bundles are placed in a large, closely woven willow basket with a lid that fits snugly over the top, and the basket is then set in a cool, dry corner of the barn to await the sieve maker's trader, who comes by every few weeks on his slow circuit through the valleys and up into the forest. The trader is a man of middle years whose name is known but seldom spoken, for his arrival is so regular and his manner so quiet that he has become simply a part of the landscape, like the post wagon or the changing of the moon. He travels with a single horse, a sturdy brown gelding with a patient eye and feathered fetlocks, hitched to a 2-wheeled cart that has seen many years of service. The cart is built of ash and elm, its boards bleached to a silvery grey by sun and rain, its iron fittings greased regularly with tallow so that they move without complaint, and its load bed is broad enough to carry several baskets and sacks of goods to and from the forest settlements. The wheels are tall, bound with iron tires that have worn thin in places and been repaired with careful patches of new metal hammered into place by the village smith. And as the cart moves, they emit a rhythmic creak that varies with the speed and the roughness of the road, a sound so constant and familiar that it lulls the trader into a kind of waking sleep on the long stretches between stops. The cart contains not only the basket of horsehair, but also other small items for the forest folk: a sack of salt, a coil of rope, a packet of needles wrapped in oiled paper, a small barrel of nails, a wedge of hard cheese for the charcoal burner who lives in a clearing to the east, and a letter or two written on coarse paper and folded into tight squares. On the morning of his departure for the sieve maker's cottage, the trader loads the cart in the grey light of dawn, checking the harness straps and the linchpin that holds the wheel to its axle, then swings up onto the narrow seat at the front of the cart, with the reins looped loosely in one hand. The gelding leans into the collar, the cart lurches gently forward, and the journey begins as it always does, with the slow clip-clop of hooves on packed earth and the first creak of the wheels turning. The road out of the village is a wide track, bordered by hedgerows of hawthorn and hazel, where sparrows flit and chatter, and the occasional rabbit sits up on its haunches to watch the cart pass before loping into the undergrowth. The air at this hour is cool and faintly misty, carrying the smell of wet grass and cow parsley, and the trader pulls his wool cloak a little tighter around his shoulders, settling into the familiar rhythm of the road. As the track leaves the valley floor and begins to climb, the hedgerows give way to stands of birch and alder, their leaves whispering in the breeze that flows down from the uplands, and the sound of the village fades behind until there is nothing but the cart's progress and the natural noises of the countryside. The road narrows now, becoming a stony track that winds between mossy banks where ferns unfurl in the damp shade, and the trader slows the gelding to a walk so that the cart does not jolt too harshly over the uneven ground. The gradient is gentle but steady, and with each turn of the wheels the air grows perceptibly cooler and sharper, losing the soft, hay-sweet warmth of the valley and gaining a resinous edge of pine and fir that blows down from the forest ahead. The trader knows this road intimately, every bend, every muddy patch, every place where a fallen branch might lie across the track after a storm, and his eyes move over the landscape with the easy attention of long habit, noting a new fox den in the bank, a tree that has leaned a little farther since last month, the first scarlet berries on a rowan. The creak of the cart wheels becomes a kind of music, a low, groaning melody that harmonizes with the cooing of wood pigeons and the distant, repetitive tap of a woodpecker drilling into a dead trunk somewhere deep among the trees. The sunlight, where it reaches the track, falls in long golden shafts that illuminate patches of moss and clusters of tiny white flowers so vividly that they seem to glow against the dark soil, and then the canopy closes overhead, and the world is plunged into a soft green twilight that shifts and quivers as the branches move. The forest deepens as the cart climbs higher, the birches and alders giving way to towering firs and ancient beeches, whose great smooth trunks rise like pillars into the dimness overhead, and the road becomes a mere path now, little more than a ribbon of bare earth winding between the massive roots that burrow across the ground. The gelding picks its way with care, its heavy feathered hooves landing with a soft thud on the needle-carpeted earth, and the cart bumps and sways with a regularity that the trader absorbs without thought, his body moving with the motion as naturally as a sailor on a boat. The air grows colder still, crisp and clean, and the trader can see his breath in small fleeting clouds when he exhales. The sounds here are muted, the bird calls higher and more scattered, the rustle of unseen animals in the undergrowth, a soft furtive whisper that comes and goes, leaving silence in its wake. The path crosses a small stream at a ford, where the water runs shallow over a bed of rounded stones, and the gelding pauses to drink, lowering its great head and sucking the cold water noisily, while the trader waits without impatience, listening to the gurgle of the brook and the drip of water falling from the cart's axles. After the horse has drunk its fill, the journey resumes, the wheels splashing through the ford and rolling on, the wet iron tires trailing dark streaks on the dry stones beyond. Now the track begins to wind in earnest, switchbacking up the steeper slopes, so that the trader can sometimes look down through gaps in the trees and see the valley spread out below like a patchwork of green and gold fields. The village a tiny cluster of red roofs, and the river a silver thread winding through it all. The view lasts only a moment before the trees close in again, but it is a familiar moment, a marker of progress on the long climb, and the trader takes it in with a quiet satisfaction before turning his attention back to the road ahead. The firs press closer now, their dark, shaggy branches interlacing overhead to form a nearly continuous roof that filters the light to a dim, submarine glow, and the undergrowth thins out until the forest floor is a deep, springy carpet of brown needles and fallen cones. The cart's creak is the loudest sound in this part of the forest, echoing slightly off the trunks that stand so close to the track, and the gelding's breath comes in steady, rhythmic plumes that hang in the still air for a moment before dissolving. After a long, slow hour of climbing, the track levels out and the trader enters a stretch of forest that is older and more open, where the trees stand farther apart and the ground is patched with soft green moss and clusters of bilberry bushes. The light here is brighter, a clear, silvery light that seems to have a different quality altogether from the golden light of the valley, and the air has the thin, invigorating crispness of higher altitudes. A few more bends, a final gentle rise, and the trader sees ahead the familiar landmark that tells him he is near the sieve maker's clearing, a tall, lightning-struck fir that leans at a peculiar angle over the path, its bare, splintered top pointed like a finger toward the sky. The gelding, too, recognizes this landmark and quickens its pace slightly, sensing the end of the climb and the prospect of rest. The cart rounds the leaning fir, and the path opens out into the clearing itself, the sudden brightness making the trader blink after so long under the canopy. The cottage stands there exactly as it always does, with its thatched roof, its quiet chimney smoke, and its garden patch neat and orderly, and the sound of the stream is now a clear, distinct murmur from the east. The trader halts the cart in the center of the clearing and climbs down, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, mossy ground. He does not call out or knock, for the sieve maker has heard the creak of the cart wheels for some time now and is already rising from the workbench, laying down the wooden shuttle and wiping his hands on a scrap of cloth before walking to the door. The two men greet each other with a nod and a few quiet words about the weather and the road. Then the trader lifts the willow basket from the cart and carries it inside the cottage, setting it down on the floor beside the work bench where the light from the window falls across the woven lid. The sieve maker kneels beside the basket, lifts the lid, and the clean, grassy scent of washed horsehair rises into the air, mixing with the wood smoke and beeswax of the room. One by one he lifts out the tied hanks, holding each one up to the light and turning it slowly to inspect the color and the sheen, running his thumb gently over the bundle to feel the springiness of the strands, checking the twine knots to see that they are secure. His inspection is thorough but unhurried, for this hair will become the sieves that millers depend on to sift their flour, and any weakness or irregularity now will mean a flawed mesh weeks later, a waste of hours of painstaking weaving. He draws a single strand from one of the warp bundles, holds it between his hands, and pulls it taut, watching the way it stretches a tiny fraction, and then holds firm without breaking, and he nods once to himself, satisfied. The fine hank wrapped in linen is opened last, and this he considers with particular care, holding the delicate silky strands close to the window so that the light shines through them, revealing a faint, warm translucence that promises an exceptionally even mesh. He rewraps the fine hank carefully and places it aside on the workbench. The transaction is simple and without ceremony. The trader receives a small pouch of coins and a freshly woven flour sieve that the sieve maker has set aside as part of their standing arrangement, a sieve that the trader's own wife will use in their kitchen to sift rye flour for the dark, dense bread they eat each day. The trader tucks the pouch into an inner pocket of his cloak, places the sieve carefully on the seat of his cart where it will not be jostled, and with a final nod, he takes up the empty willow basket and steps back out into the clearing. The gelding, who has been cropping the grass near the garden fence, lifts its head and allows itself to be led back onto the path, and the cart creaks away into the forest, the sound diminishing slowly until it is swallowed by the sigh of the wind in the firs, leaving the clearing once again in its deep and patient quiet. Inside the cottage, the sieve maker turns back to the open basket of horsehair, and the next phase of the work begins. He carries the hanks, one armful at a time, across the room to the shelves beside the hearth, where the long linen bags hang from the rafters like empty pillowcases waiting to be filled. Each bag is already labeled with its purpose: warp, weft, fine, in faint charcoal marks on birch bark tags, and the sieve maker unties the drawstring closures and begins to fill them, sliding the hanks down into the soft linen depths with a gentle rustling sound. The warp hair goes into one bag, the weft into another, the special fine hair into a smaller bag that hangs a little apart. And when all the hair has been stored, the sieve maker pulls the drawstrings tight and pats the bulging bags once, as if settling them for a long sleep. The hair will stay here, hanging in the dry, warm air above the hearth, until the sieve maker is ready to sit down at the workbench and begin the careful, painstaking task of sorting each individual strand by length and thickness. A task that will occupy the next chapter in the quiet story of the sieve. The fire murmurs, the light slants through the bubbled glass, and the cottage settles back into its rhythm, richer now by several hundred strands of good horsehair, ready and waiting. With the horsehair safely stored in the linen bags, and the trader's cart long since banished into the forest, the cottage settles back into its deep and patient quiet, and you find yourself still standing near the workbench, drawn to the calm order of the space. The morning light has strengthened a little, shifting from a pale silver to a warmer tone that picks out the grain of the beechwood and sets the dust motes spinning in slow, lazy spirals, and the sieve maker, having banked the hearth fire with a fresh log that will burn low and steady for hours, now turns his attention to the workbench itself. This is the true beginning of the sieve-making process, not the gathering of materials or the weaving of mesh, but the careful, deliberate preparation of the workspace and the tools that will be used. A ritual that has not changed in all the years he has lived in this clearing. He crosses the room with the quiet, unhurried step of a man who has nowhere else to be, his wooden clogs making a soft, rhythmic tap on the floorboards, and he stands for a moment at the bench, resting his hands lightly on its worn surface, feeling the cool, smooth wood under his palms, letting his gaze travel across the arrangement of tools, as if greeting old friends. You can see now, in the improved light, just how beautifully the workbench has been made and how many years of labor it has absorbed. The slab of beech is a full 2 inches thick, its edges slightly rounded from countless brushings of sleeves and elbows, and its surface, though sanded smooth long ago, now bears a map of the thousands of sieves that have been woven upon it. There are faint, parallel grooves running across the grain, where the wooden draw plate has been slid back and forth, worn channels so shallow that a fingertip can barely detect them, but visible to the eye as a subtle stripping in the wood. And there are small dark spots of beeswax that have dripped and hardened over time, now polished to a dull sheen by the constant friction of work. Near the front edge, where the sieve maker's body presses against the bench as he leans forward, the wood has taken on a deeper, richer color. The oils from his hands and the rubbing of his linen apron having burnished the surface to a soft glow that contrasts with the paler, matte finish of the rest. The 4 legs that support the slab are thick and sturdy, set into mortises that are being pegged with oak dowels, and the whole bench is so heavy and solid that even a hard shove would barely shift it. Yet it stands with a certain lightness of proportion that speaks of a carpenter who understood both strength and grace. A low, 3-legged stool of the same pale beech stands before the bench, its seat slightly scooped from years of use so that it cups the sitter comfortably, and the sieve maker gives it a small nudge with his foot to adjust its position, aligning it exactly with the center of the window's light. He then turns his attention to the small wooden mallet that lies at the far right of the bench, where it is always kept when not in use, its head resting on a small leather pad that prevents it from rolling and keeps the striking face from contact with the wood. This mallet is not a heavy carpenter's tool, but a light, precise instrument used for tapping the sieve rims into place, and it is carved from a single piece of boxwood that has aged to a warm, golden brown color, its handle worn to a perfect smoothness that fits the grip of the hand without any conscious adjustment. The sieve maker picks it up, hafts it once to test its familiar weight, and runs his thumb over the striking face to check for splinters or cracks, finding none because the boxwood is a dense, tight-grained wood that takes polish well and resists splitting. He sets it down again precisely on the leather pad, its handle angled toward him for easy reach, and his hand moves next to the set of wooden draw plates, which are perhaps the most clever and simple of all the sieve maker's tools. These draw plates are flat, rectangular pieces of beech, each about the length of a man's hand and a little wider than a thumb, and each one is pierced with a row of holes that diminish in size from one end to the other, the smallest no bigger than a pinprick and the largest wide enough to admit a pencil. The holes are not simple drillings but have been carefully countersunk and smoothed on the underside, so that a horsehair drawn through from the rough side emerges on the smooth side with its diameter reduced and its surface polished, and the sieve maker picks up each plate in turn, holding it to the light to see that no dust or fibre has lodged in the holes, blowing gently through the larger ones to clear them, and wiping the smaller ones with the corner of a linen cloth that he keeps tucked in his prappen pocket. Beside the draw plates rests the curved awl, a tool as simple as it is essential, consisting of a slim, tapered steel shaft that comes to a needle-sharped point, set into a handle of polished boxwood that fits the palm like a river stone fits the hand. The awl is used for teasing apart strands of hair that have become tangled, for adjusting the tension of the warp on the loom, and for the fine, delicate work of tucking the cut ends of the mesh between the rims, and its point must be kept perfectly sharp and free of rust. The sieve maker draws the awl from its slot in a small wooden block that holds it upright, holds the point up to the light, and turns it slowly, checking the tiny mirror-bright facet at the tip for any sign of a burr or a dull spot. Satisfied, he runs the point once, very lightly, over a small strip of leather mounted on the side of the bench, a strop that has been dressed with the finest abrasive powder, and this quick pass aligns the microscopic edge and restores the polish. He slots the awl back into its block, the handle standing upright ready for the next time it will be needed, and his hand continues its slow, methodical circuit of the bench. The spool of fine linen thread comes next, a wooden bobbin wound with perhaps 100 yards of strong, pale cord that has been twisted from flax fibres grown in the valley and spun by a woman whose name the sieve maker knows but seldom speaks, for the thread arrives in his basket of supplies without any fanfare. The thread is no thicker than a coarse human hair and very tightly twisted, with a faint, natural waxiness from the flax that helps it grip and hold knots, but it will be run through the bowl of beeswax before use to give it additional strength and to smooth down any tiny fibres that might otherwise catch on the horsehair. The sieve maker lifts the spool, checks that the thread is wound evenly and that the end is secured in a little slit on the rim of the bobbin, and then places it exactly where his left hand will be able to find it without looking when the weaving begins. The spool rests in a shallow depression in the bench that has been worn by just this purpose over many years, so that it will not roll or shift, a small detail that speaks of a life lived in deep familiarity with one's tools. The iron shears are the largest and perhaps the humblest of the tools, a pair of simple blades joined by a loop of springy iron at the back, the handles bound with strips of linen to cushion the grip, and the cutting edges showing the fine, parallel scratches of a recent sharpening. The sieve maker tests them by opening and closing the blades a few times, listening for any roughness in the action or any misalignment of the edges, and finding none, he lays them on the bench with the points facing away from his body, a habit so ingrained that he could not say if he has ever placed them otherwise. The shears will be used to trim the woven mesh to size and to cut the horsehair from the loom, and their sharpness must be maintained with care, so the sieve maker makes a mental note that the blades will need a touch on the whetstone before the next full moon. The note is not written down but stored somewhere in the back of his mind, with the note is not written down but stored somewhere in the back of his mind, with the same casual precision that a shepherd remembers the faces of his sheep. Finally, his attention comes to the shallow bowl of beeswax that sits at the back of the bench, near the window where the warmth of the sun keeps the wax just slightly softened to a consistency like chilled butter. The bowl is a simple piece of earthenware, unglazed on the outside where it has absorbed the oils of countless batches of beeswax and taken on a deep, ruddy brown patina, while the inside is glazed with a clear, honey-coloured coating that makes it easy to clean. The wax itself is a pale, translucent gold, smelling faintly of clover and summer meadows, and it has been rendered and filtered by a beekeeper in the valley, so that it contains no specks of dirt or bee parts, only the pure, waxy essence of the comb. The sieve maker dips a finger into the bowl, tests the softness, and because the morning is still cool, he moves the bowl an inch closer to the window where the sun will warm it a little more, a small adjustment that requires no thought but which makes the later work just that much easier. Beside the bowl lies a small flat stick of birchwood that serves as a wax applicator, its end rounded and polished by repeated dipping, and the sieve maker ensures that it is lying flat and clean, ready for the moment when he will draw the linen thread across the wax. With all the tools inspected and arranged, the sieve maker now turns his attention to the first of the sieve frames that will be the foundation of today's work. These frames, or rims, are slender hoops of beechwood that have been bent and joined in the shed outside, and a stack of a dozen or so stands on the low shelf beneath the bench, the wood still pale and fresh, smelling faintly of the steam that was used to soften them into shape. The sieve maker selects one from the stack and lays it flat on the bench, turning it slowly in the pool of light from the window, looking for any irregularity in the joint or any splinter that might catch on the horsehair, and finding none, he sets it on a small rack that holds the rim at a convenient angle for the later stages of assembly. He will not start weaving yet. The preparation alone will take the better part of the morning, and he moves through it with the slow, steady rhythm of a man who values the journey as much as the destination. He checks the light one more time, noting how the sun has crept a few inches across the floorboards, and how the beam now falls more directly on the center of the bench, illuminating the grain of the wood and the faint shining lines of the drawplate grooves. And he decides that the light is as good as it will be for several hours. He adjusts the stool once more, just a fraction, and then he sits down, his body settling into the familiar hollow of the seat with the ease of long habit, and he places both hands flat on the bench, palms down, feeling the cool, smooth surface and the faint vibrations of the cottage around him, the murmur of the fire, the whisper of the breeze in the chimney, the distant, endless song of the stream. For a moment he simply sits, not thinking, not planning, just being present in the space, and you can feel the quiet of the room become even deeper, as if the cottage itself is settling down beside him, ready to watch the work unfold. The tools wait in their places, the horsehair hangs ready in its bags, and the day stretches ahead, long and peaceful and full of the simple, patient labor that will turn a handful of hair into a thing of usefulness and quiet beauty. You notice that even your own breathing has slowed to match the pace of the room, and the world outside the clearing seems very far away indeed, a distant place of hurry and noise that cannot reach you here. The sieve maker reaches for the first draw plate, the one with the largest hole, and the morning's work begins. The morning continues to unfold with the same slow, even pace that governs all things in the cottage, and as the light strengthens to a steady pale gold that fills the room, the sieve maker rises from his stool and steps away from the workbench, his tools arranged and waiting. He crosses to the door and passes through it into the cool, fresh air of the clearing, where the stream murmurs and the firs stand dark and silent, and he walks the short, well-trodden path to the workshed that leans against the side of the cottage. This shed, open to the air along its front but roofed with the same rye thatch, is a place of wooden shavings and the clean, sharp scent of beech, and it is here that the sieve frames are made, a separate process from the weaving, but equally patient and careful. Inside, the ground is bare earth packed hard by years of footsteps, and a long, low workbench of rough pine runs along the back wall, its surface cluttered with the simple tools of wood bending, a draw knife, a small plane, a mallet heavier than the one on the weaving bench, a wooden form shaped like a section of a large cylinder, and a bundle of thin beechwood strips that have been seasoning for many months. The beechwood strips are the foundation of every sieve frame, and their story begins not in the shed, but at the edge of the forest where the trees grow differently than in the deep woods. There, on a south-facing slope, where the soil is thinner and the light more plentiful, a stand of coppice beech trees has been managed for generations by the charcoal burners and woodworkers of the region, cut back to the stump every 15 or 20 years, so that the stumps send up a cluster of straight, vigorous shoots. These shoots, known as poles, grow tall and slender with very few side branches, their grain straight and their bark smooth and silvery grey, and after perhaps a decade they have reached the thickness of a man's wrist, which is exactly the size required for sieve rims. The sieve maker himself cuts these poles in late winter when the sap is still down and the wood is at its driest, selecting only those that are perfectly straight and free of knots, and he hauls them back to the clearing on a simple sled pulled by a neighbour's ox, the poles bound together with rope and dragging a long, shallow furrow in the leaf litter. In the shed, The poles are left to season for a full year or more, stacked on battens with spaces between each layer, so that the air can circulate and draw the moisture out slowly, for wood dried too fast will crack and check, while wood dried too slowly may rot or develop fungal stains. The seasoning shed is a quiet, dusty place where the only sound is the occasional rustle of a woodlouse or the creak of a timber settling, and the beechwood poles lie there in patient stillness, slowly turning from a pale sappy white to a warm golden brown that tells the sieve maker they are ready. When a pole is needed, the sieve maker selects one from the pile, hefts it to feel its weight and the dry, resonant quality of its wood, and carries it to the workbench, where he secures it in a simple vise made of 2 wooden screws. Using a small, sharp drawknife with handles at both ends, he strips away the silvery bark in long, curling strips that fall to the floor with a soft, papery rustle, revealing the smooth, pale wood beneath, still faintly cool to the touch. The bark is set aside to be used later as tinder for the hearth, and the strict pole is then split lengthwise with a froe and a wooden club, the froe's blade driven down through the end grain with a series of soft, measured thuds that send a gentle vibration through the bench. The pole splits cleanly along its grain into several straight lengths, and from these the sieve maker chooses the best sections, those without any hidden knots or wavy fibers, and sets the rest aside for other uses, perhaps pegs or tool handles or simple kindling. The chosen sections are then reduced with the drawknife again, shaved down to a thin, even width, the blade singing a soft, shushing note as it peels away wafer-thin curls of wood that spiral to the floor in a growing pile around the sieve maker's clogs. The goal is a strip of beech about the width of 2 fingers and the thickness of a few sheets of paper, so thin that it can be bent into a circle without cracking, yet strong enough that once it is fixed in shape, it will hold its form for a lifetime of use. Achieving this thinness requires patience and a steady hand, because the drawknife must be drawn at precisely the right angle, not too steep, or it will dig in and splinter the wood, not too shallow, or it will skate over the surface without cutting, and the pressure must be even across the whole width of the blade. The sieve maker works slowly, pausing often to run his thumb over the surface and feel for any high spots or uneven areas, and each pause is an opportunity to look up and notice the light shifting through the open front of the shed, the distant chitter of a squirrel in the firs, the soft, cool breeze that carries the scent of water from the stream. When the strip is thin enough to flex easily in his hands, he sets it aside and begins the same process on a second strip, because every sieve needs 2 rims, an inner and an outer, that will later be fitted together to trap the woven mesh. The 2 strips must be as identical as handwork can make them, for if one is thicker than the other, the rims will not seat properly, and the mesh will be loose or twisted, and a sieve that is not perfectly true is of no use to a miller who relies on a smooth, even sift. So the sieve maker measures frequently with a simple wooden gauge, a flat stick with a notch cut into the end, passing each strip through the notch to test that it is of uniform thickness along its entire length. And he shaves a little more where the gauge tells him, and less where it is already correct, until both strips meet his satisfaction. With the strips prepared, the next phase of the frame construction can begin, and this is the bending, which requires warmth and moisture and a slow, gradual pressure that coaxes rather than forces the wood into its new shape. The sieve maker sets a pot of water to heat on a small iron stove that stands in the corner of the shed, a tiny thing no bigger than a bread box, its belly filled with glowing coals that he carries from the hearth in a long-handled iron scoop. The water in the pot is stream water, clear and cold, and as it warms, it begins to give off a faint, clean steam that fobs the air just above the rim and carries with it no smell at all, just the pure, blank scent of heated water. When the water is hot but not boiling, just on the edge of a simmer where tiny bubbles cling to the sides of the pot, the sieve maker slides one of the strips into the water and lets it soak, weighting it down with a smooth river stone to keep it fully submerged. The soaking is a slow affair, for the beechwood must absorb enough water to become pliable without becoming saturated and weak, and the sieve maker lets it rest in the warm water for the length of time it takes for the sun to move from the window frame to the edge of the workbench, which is as good a clock as any. During this time he tidies the shed, sweeping the wood shavings into a basket for kindling, wiping the drawknife blade with an oiled rag to keep rust away, checking the iron stove's draft, and occasionally testing the strip by lifting it slightly from the water and giving it a gentle flex, feeling the resistance slowly lessen as the warmth and moisture work their way into the fibers. When the strip has reached the right degree of suppleness, pliable as a leather strap but not floppy, the sieve maker lifts it from the water and lets the excess drip back into the pot for a moment, then carries it, trailing a few cool drops, to the wooden bending form. This form is a beautiful object in its own right. A section of a large old beech trunk that has been turned on a lathe to a perfect cylinder, the exact inner diameter of a finished sieve, and it stands upright on the workbench, fixed to a heavy base that prevents it from moving. The surface of the form is smooth as glass from years of use, and it has absorbed a little of the wood's natural oils from all the strips that have been bent around it, so that it has a soft, living sheen that catches the light. The sieve maker takes the warm, flexible strip and begins to bend it slowly around the form, starting at one end and working his way along, his hands applying a gentle, constant pressure that follows the curve exactly. The wood resists at first with a faint creaking sound, the sound of thousands of tiny fibers stretching and realigning, but the warmth has softened the natural lignin that binds the fibers together, and gradually the strip yields, taking on the cylindrical shape without a single crack or splinter. The sieve maker works around the form until the strip overlaps itself by a hand's width, and he holds it there with one hand, while his other hand reaches for the small wooden pegs that will secure the joint. These pegs are made from offcuts of the same beech wood, whittled down to tiny cones no longer than a thumbnail and as thin as a knitting needle, and they sit in a small compartmented box on the bench, each compartment holding a different size. Sieve maker selects 2 pegs of the smallest size and, while still holding the strip in place with a firm, even pressure, uses a hand drill to bore 2 tiny holes through the overlapping section, a drill with a wooden handle and a bit no thicker than a needle that turns with a soft humming zip as his fingers twirl it. The holes are precisely aligned, drilled clean through the 2 layers of wood, and then he taps the pegs into the holes with the lightest possible taps of the wooden mallet. The same mallet from the cottage bench, but used here for a different purpose. Its small, flat head making a series of soft, woody clicks that are echoed by the shed's timber walls. The pegs fit snugly, filling the holes completely, and a tiny smear of hide glue is worked into the joint beforehand to add extra strength, the glue having been melted in a small pot on the iron stove and smelling faintly of boiled bones and old leather. A clean, sharp scent that is not unpleasant. The glue will take an hour or so to set fully, and during that time the strip must remain in the form, so the sieve maker sets the whole assembly aside on a shelf and turns his attention to the second strip, which has been warming in the pot while he worked, and he repeats the entire soaking, bending, drilling and pegging process with the same slow, careful rhythm, producing a second hoop that matches the first exactly. When both hoops have set and the glue has dried to a hard amber-clear finish, the sieve maker lifts them from the forms and sets them aside while he prepares for the next stage, which is the planing and sanding that will give the rims their final smoothness and ensure that they are perfectly round and true. He places one hoop on the workbench and secures it gently with a padded clamp that holds it without crushing the wood, and he takes up the small plane, a tool no larger than his hand, its blade set to take off the very finest shavings, so fine that they are almost transparent and drift through the air like fragments of gossamer before settling on the bench. The plane is an heirloom, given to him by the old sieve maker who taught him the trade decades ago, and its wooden body has been polished by countless hours of use until it feels warm and alive in the hand. The blade, a small rectangle of Swedish steel, kept so sharp that it whispers through the beech as if cutting butter. The sieve maker passes the plane over the outer surface of the hoop, not to remove any significant amount of wood, but simply to smooth away the tiny irregularities left by the draw knife and bending, each pass producing a long, unbroken shaving that curls up like a fern frond and drops to the growing heap on the floor. He works around the entire circumference, overlapping each pass with the last so that no ridge remains. And then he checks the progress with his fingertips, closing his eyes to better feel the texture, finding one small rough spot near the joint, and planing it again with 3 short, precise strokes that blend it into the surrounding curve. The plane's blade sings its soft, high note, and the shed is filled with the clean, sweet scent of fresh beech, a scent that is warm and a little nutty, like the aroma of beech mast underfoot in the autumn. Once the plane has done its work, the sieve maker moves to the sanding, which is the most time-consuming part of the frame building and the one that requires the greatest patience, for the surface of the rim must be so smooth that a strand of horsehair drawn across it will not catch or snag on any fiber or imperfection, not even one so tiny that it is invisible to the eye. For this he does not use modern sandpaper, which does not exist in 1750, but a bundle of dried horsetail stems, a plant that grows in abundance along the banks of the stream and which contains a high concentration of silica, nature's own abrasive. The stems are straight and jointed, like tiny bamboo, and when dried and bundled together they form a flexible abrasive brush that the sieve maker rubs back and forth over the wood, the silica particles scratching the surface to a smooth, matte polish that has a soft, velvety feel. The sound of horsetail sanding is a gentle, rhythmic hushing, like the sound of a hand brushing fabric. And the sieve maker works his way around the hoop with the same deliberate care that he uses for every task, checking his progress frequently with the same wooden gauge used earlier, running the notch along the curve to ensure that the rim is round and that no flat spots have developed during the bending. The gauge fits tightly, and where it sticks or lifts, the sieve maker sands a little more or a little less, adjusting the pressure of his hand by fractions that only he can feel. The final check for roundness is done with a special template, a flat board of seasoned oak, into which a perfect circle has been cut, a circle that represents the exact outer diameter of a finished sieve rim. The template hangs on a nail on the shed wall when not in use, and the sieve maker takes it down and lays it on the bench, then lowers the rim into the cutout, watching the way the light shows through any gaps between the wood and the template's inner edge. A perfect rim will drop into the template with a soft, precise click, touching the template evenly on all sides without any pressure, and if the rim does not fit, the sieve maker must plane and sand and check again, a cycle of small corrections that can take the better part of an hour for each rim. On this particular morning, the first rim fits well enough after only a few additional passes of the horsetail bundle, and the sieve maker lifts it from the template and sets it on a rack that holds the finished rims, a rack made of 2 wooden pegs driven into the shed wall where the hoops hang in neat nested rows, glimmering faintly in the dim light. The second rim follows, needing only a tiny adjustment at the joint where the pegging had left a slight ridge, and then it too is hung on the rack, its pale beechwood surface glowing with a soft, satiny luster. The sieve maker steps back and surveys the rack, counting the pairs of rims that are ready for the next stage of the work, the weaving of the mesh, and he notes that he has enough for perhaps a week of steady weaving before he will need to make more, a comfortable cushion that allows him to settle into the rhythm of the loom without interruption. He wipes his hands on a rag, cleans the plain blade with a drop of oil, sweeps the shavings into the basket, and checks the iron stove, which is burned down to a bed of grey ash that he will sift later for the charcoal bits that are useful for marking lines. The shed is quiet now, the tools put away, the bending form standing clean and ready, the pot of water cooled and emptied into a bucket for the garden, and the whole space has the satisfied, orderly atmosphere of a task completed without haste or error. The sieve maker takes one last look at the 2 new rims hanging on the rack, their thin, elegant curves perfectly matched, and then he steps out of the shed into the clearing, blinking a little in the stronger light of midday, the warmth of the sun on his face, a gentle contrast to the cooler dimness of the shed. He walks back toward the cottage, his clogs crunching softly on the gravel of the path, and the stream's murmur rises to meet him as he goes, a constant, soothing presence that never changes and never fades. The rims are ready, the tools are prepared, and the next part of the sieve's slow creation, the sorting and sizing of the horsehair itself, will soon begin. The morning outside the cottage had settled into that long, quiet stretch between breakfast and midday, when the light seems to pause in its climb and the forest holds its breath, and inside, the sieve maker sat at his workbench with the patience of a man who had no reason to hurry. The tools, the stool, the light, all had been arranged to his satisfaction during the earlier preparations, and now the focus of the work shifted to the raw material itself, the horsehair that had arrived in the trader's basket and now hung in linen bags from the rafters. He reached up to the bag marked for warp, loosened the drawstring, and drew out one of the tied hanks. its pale strands shimmering faintly as they emerged into the daylight. And then he laid the hank on the bench before him, untying the twine that bound its folded end and spreading the hair out in a long, loose fan across the beechwood surface. The hair, washed and dried and bundled with care, had retained its alignment surprisingly well, the strands lying roughly parallel like a sheaf of fine, glossy straw, but there were still tangles here and there where a few hairs had twisted around their neighbors, and the first task was simply to loosen and separate the mass until every strand lay free and independent. He did this not by pulling, but by gently shaking the bundle from the tied end, letting the strands fall apart of their own weight, and then by working his fingertips slowly through the fibers, teasing apart any knots without tugging or breaking, a motion so light and practiced that it barely disturbed the air. The hair rustled with a soft papery sound, and the faint, clean scent of it drifted up, a smell like dry grass crushed underfoot on a summer path. When the hair lay fully loose, a shimmering pool of color across the dark wood, the sieve maker reached for the measuring stick that hung from a small hook on the side of the bench. This stick was a plain length of straight-grained pine about the length of a man's forearm, and it had been marked with a series of fine, burned lines that divided it into precise units of measure. The shortest usable length for the warp near one end, the ideal length in the middle, and the mark beyond which a strand was considered too short and would be set aside for other uses. The stick had darkened with age and handling, its surface burnished to a soft gleam that made the burned lines stand out clearly, and the sieve maker laid it on the bench parallel to the edge, where it would serve as a constant reference. Beside it, he placed 3 small, shallow baskets woven of willow, each lined with a scrap of clean linen, and these baskets would receive the sorted hair according to its grade. The first for the long, strong warp strands of standard length, the second for the slightly shorter or thinner strands that would do for the weft, and the third for the rare, perfect hairs of exceptional length and fineness that would be reserved for the finest sieves. With everything in place, the sorting began. The sieve maker picked up a single strand from the mass of hair, taking it between thumb and forefinger near the cut end, and drew it slowly through his other hand to straighten it, feeling the slight springiness, the tiny vibrations that ran along its length as the natural curve was pulled flat. He then laid the strand against the measuring stick, aligning one end with the baseline mark, and let his eye travel along the hair to where it ended, noting whether it reached the minimum length or fell short. This particular strand, a pale blonde with a slight wave near the tip, just touched the first qualifying mark, so he placed it gently into the first basket, the warp basket, and already his hand was reaching for the next strand before the first had fully settled. The rhythm established itself quickly, a smooth, flowing cycle of pick, draw, measure, place, repeated without variation but without haste, each strand receiving the same unhurried attention. The light from the window fell across his hands, illuminating the individual hairs so that they glowed like filaments of spun glass, their colors ranging from cream and honey to chestnut and dark walnut, and occasionally a strand of deep black that stood out starkly against the pale wood of the bench. The variations in the hair were subtle but significant to the sieve maker's trained eye. Some strands were thick and round in cross-section, almost wiry, with a pronounced natural curl that sprang back when released, and these he knew would make excellent warp threads because their stiffness would hold the mesh open. Others were flatter, more ribbon-like, with a softer, silkier feel that spoke of a different breed of horse or perhaps a different part of the tail, and these he assigned to the weft basket because they would bend more easily around the warp without kinking. A few strands were noticeably tapered, thick at the root end and fine at the tip, and these he examined with extra care, measuring the thick end against the warp mark and the thin end against the weft, sometimes deciding to place them in the warp basket if the majority of the strand was sturdy enough, sometimes in the weft if the taper was too pronounced. The sorting was not a mechanical process, but a constant flowing series of small judgments, each one made so quickly and naturally that it seemed less like a decision and more like a recognition, the sieve maker's fingers knowing the quality of a hair before his mind had formed the thought. The pile in the first basket grew steadily, a soft pale mound of aligned strands that shifted and settled with a gentle sigh each time a new hair was added. The second basket filled more slowly, for the weft strands were slightly less numerous in this particular batch, the horses in the valley having produced an abundance of thick, strong hair that winter, and the sieve maker noted this with the same quiet attention that a cook notes the quality of the flour. The third basket, the one reserved for the finest strands, remained nearly empty for a long time, because hairs of that exceptional length and uniformity were rare indeed. But when he did find one, a long, flawless strand of deep honey color that stretched well past the top mark on the measuring stick and felt like smooth silk between his fingers. He held it up to the light for a moment of pure appreciation before laying it carefully in the linen-lined basket as if it were a small treasure. That basket would hold perhaps only a dozen or two such strands by the end of the sorting, but those few would be enough to weave a small patch of the finest mesh, the kind that a miller would use for the very last sifting of his whitest flour. The work continued, the light creeping an almost imperceptible fraction across the bench, the fire in the hearth settling into a bed of glowing embers with only the occasional soft pop, and the only sounds in the room were the whisper of hair against hair, the faint tap of the measuring stick when it was shifted, and the distant murmur of the stream that had become so familiar it was no longer noticed. The sieve maker's hands moved with a calm, automatic precision, the left hand holding the bundle and feeding strands forward, the right hand plucking and drawing and measuring, the two working together in a quiet harmony that had been honed over many thousands of repetitions. Occasionally a strand would resist, tangled or kinked, and he would pause just long enough to work it free with the tip of the awl, or to discard it into a small scrap pile at the edge of the bench. But these interruptions were few and brief, absorbed into the larger rhythm like a small stone in a stream. The quality of the hair changed subtly as he worked deeper into the hank. The very first strands from the folded end of the bundle had been the most uniform because they had lain protected in the center, but as he drew closer to the edges he encountered strands that had been exposed to more rubbing during transport and had developed a slight fuzziness, their outer scales roughened. These he did not discard, but placed in a separate little pile, for they could still be used if drawn through a slightly smaller hole in the draw plate, a process that would compress and smooth them. He made a mental note to dress these strands later, and the mental note joined the other small, quiet intentions that floated through his awareness like leaves on a pond, never urgent, never forgotten. The draw plate itself sat at the ready, its row of diminishing holes gleaming faintly, but it would not be needed for most of the hair that passed muster on the measuring stick. As one hank was emptied, the sieve maker tied up the twine that had bound it and set it aside, then reached up to the linen bag for another, loosening the drawstring and drawing out a fresh bundle. And the whole process began again with the gentle spreading, the untying, the first tentative separation of the strands. This second hank proved to be richer in the dark brown hairs, and the palette on the bench shifted perceptibly from pale honey to warm chestnut. A change that the sieve maker observed with the same mild, detached interest that a painter might study a new tube of pigment. The dark hairs were perhaps a shade coarser than the pale ones, with a slightly heavier feel in the hand, and he adjusted his sorting criteria by a hair's breadth, allowing a marginally shorter length into the warp basket because the extra stiffness would compensate for the loss of spam. It was this constant, slight adjustment that made the work a craft rather than a mere task, a living, responsive conversation between the hands and the material, conducted in silence and at a pace that allowed no error to pass unnoticed. The morning wore on, and the quality of the light began to change again, the beam from the window shifting from the center of the bench toward the edge where the basket of weft strands sat, illuminating the soft, pale mound with a golden glow. The sieve maker, noticing the shift, reached for the small clay bowl of beeswax and the thread that would later be used to bind the sieves, and he drew a length of thread across the wax a few times to coat it, the wax softening under the friction and releasing its faint, honeyed fragrance. He set the thread aside and returned to the sorting, his hands finding their rhythm again without any visible break, the interruption having been no more than a few heartbeats long. The scrap pile at the edge of the bench had grown into a small tangled nest of short bits and fuzzy rejects, and he gathered these up with a sweep of his palm and dropped them into a sack that hung from the side of the stall, a sack that would eventually go to the garden as mulch, or be traded to a bird's nest collector in the village, for nothing here was wasted. Every strand of horsehair, no matter how short or coarse, had a place in the quiet economy of the forest. The measuring stick, worn smooth by years of use, had acquired a slight hollow on one edge where the sieve maker's thumb pressed it against the bench, a subtle indentation that fit his grip exactly. And as he aligned strand after strand, he felt the reassuring familiarity of that fit, the way it guided his hand without him having to look. The burned marks, though faint, were still legible, and he sometimes traced one with his fingernail out of sheer habit, feeling the slight roughness of the charred line beneath the polished surface. The stick had been made by his own hand many years ago, cut from a pine sapling that had grown at the edge of the clearing and seasoned in the rafters for a full year before being worked, and it had outlasted many of the other tools, the draw plates that had split, the awls that had been sharpened down to stubs, the mallet handles that had grown thin, but this simple measuring stick remained, as constant as the stream. As the sorting neared its end and the last few strands of the final hank lay on the bench, the sieve maker's pace slowed just slightly, not from fatigue, but from a natural deceleration that came with the completion of a cycle, the same way a horse slackens its pace as it approaches the stable. He drew the last strand through his fingers, measured it, found it just shy of the weft mark, and placed it in the scrap sack without regret, then sat back on the stool for a moment, his hands resting loosely on his thighs. The 3 baskets stood before him, each filled with its respective grade of hair, the warp basket holding the largest share, a soft, dense mass of strong, straight strands, the weft basket holding a smaller amount of slightly finer hair, and the fine basket holding its precious few strands of exceptional quality, each lying as straight and luminous as a ray of light. The empty hanks were folded neatly and placed on the shelf, their twine ties coiled and tucked beside them, and the scrap sack was closed with a drawstring and hung back on its hook. The sorting was done, but the work was not finished, for the hair would now need to be drawn through the draw plates to ensure perfect uniformity, a process that would occupy the early afternoon. But that was a task for after the midday meal. For now, the sieve maker stood, stretched his shoulders once, and walked to the hearth to stir the embers and hang the pot of broth over the renewed flame. His movements as slow and peaceful as the forest outside, which rustled on in its own quiet life, unbothered and eternal. The sorting of the horsehair had been completed, and the 3 willow baskets sat on the shelf beside the workbench, their contents ready for the next stage of the sieve's slow journey toward completion. And now, the sieve maker turned his attention to the loom that stood in the corner by the hearth. This loom was not a large room-filling apparatus like those used by the weavers of cloth in the valley towns, but a compact, upright frame, no taller than a man and no wider than his outstretched arms, built entirely of ash wood that had aged to a soft, silvery grey. The ash had been chosen for its straight grain and its peculiar ability to absorb tension without warping, and the loom's maker, a carpenter in the village who had long since passed his skills to his son, had taken care to select timbers that had grown slowly on a northern slope, where the tight growth rings gave the wood a dense, resilient strength. The frame consisted of 2 upright posts, set into a heavy baseboard that kept the whole structure stable, connected at the top by a horizontal crossbar and at the bottom by a freely turning roller that could be adjusted with a simple iron handle. And the posts were joined to the base and crossbar by mortise and tenon joints, secured with oak pegs that had been driven in while the wood was still slightly green, so that they had shrunk over Tomd, as tight as if the pieces had grown together. The loom stood in the corner nearest the fire, where the constant warmth kept the wood from becoming damp and swollen, and its presence there was so familiar that it seemed almost a part of the architecture, like the hearth itself or the great beech beam overhead. The sieve maker approached the loom and ran a hand over one of the upright posts, feeling the smooth, worn surface and the faint vertical grain lines that rippled under his palm, checking for any sign of a crack or a looseness in the joints that might develop under the tension of the warp. The loom had been used the week before and had held its setting perfectly, but it was his habit to inspect before each new setup, a small ritual that honored the tool and prevented the small errors that could accumulate into a spoiled mesh. He took hold of the crossbar and gave it a gentle shake, feeling the solid, unyielding resistance that told him the pegs were still tight, and then he knelt to examine the lower roller, turning the iron handle slowly to ensure that the mechanism moved freely, without any grinding or sticking. The roller was a thick cylinder of ash, its surface scored with a faint spiral groove that helped grip the warp strands, and its axle ran in sockets that had been lubricated with a smear of tallow, giving off the faintest odor of rendered fat that mingled with the wood smoke. Satisfied that the loom was ready, the sieve maker returned to the workbench and lifted the willow basket filled with the long, strong warp strands, carrying it carefully to the stool that stood before the loom, where he set it down and sat for a moment, the basket on the floor beside his right hand, the light from the window falling obliquely across the frame and casting a soft lattice of shadows on the wall. The warp setting was a task that required a particular kind of patience, a willingness to do the same small motion many hundreds of times, without any variation in care or attention, and the sieve maker settled into it with the same quiet acceptance that he brought to all his work. He reached into the basket and drew out a single horsehair, holding it up to the light for a moment to confirm that it was one of the long, sturdy strands he had set aside for this purpose, and then he turned his attention to the top crossbar of the loom. The crossbar was notched at regular intervals along its underside, a series of tiny V-shaped grooves that had been cut with a fine saw and then smoothed with a folded strip of sanded leather, and these notches would hold the warp strands in their precise spacing, each one exactly the width of the desired mesh opening from its neighbor. The standard flower sieve required a mesh with openings of about 1/12 of an inch, and the notches had been laid out accordingly by the sieve maker's own hand, using a marking gauge and a magnifying lens made of polished rock crystal that he kept wrapped in a soft cloth in a drawer of the bench. The notches were so small and so close together that they were almost invisible at a glance, but his fingers knew their positions by touch, and he could find each one without looking, like a musician finding the stops on a flute. Beginning at the far left edge of the crossbar, he took the first horsehair and formed a small slip knot at one end, a knot that would hold securely under tension but could be released with a quick pull when the weaving was done and the mesh needed to be cut free. The hair was springy and resisted the tight bend, but he worked it with a gentle, patient pressure, coaxing it into a loop and drawing the free end through to form the knot, then pulling it just tight enough to grip the strand without kinking it. He then slipped the loop over the first notch on the crossbar, settling it into the groove so that the hair hung straight down, its lower end brushing the base of the loom with a few inches to spare. The knot was seated with a tiny, precise tug, and the first warp strand was in place, a single pale line shimmering against the darker wood of the frame. The second strand followed in the same manner. A slip knot formed and slipped over the second notch, and then the third and the fourth, each one taking perhaps 20 seconds of calm, unhurried attention. The sieve maker's hands moved in a steady cycle, reach into the basket, draw out a hair, hold it to the light, form the knot, seat it in the notch, tug gently to test. The warp strands began to multiply, hanging side by side in a row that grew gradually from left to right across the width of the loom. And as the row grew, the hairs occasionally tangled at their lower ends, swaying and twisting around one another like the stems of water plants in a slow current. The sieve maker paused from time to time to run his hand gently down the hanging strands, smoothing out any tangles, aligning the lower ends so that they all fell to the same point, a simple, soothing motion that set the hairs to shimmering in unison. When perhaps a dozen warp strands had been hung, the sieve maker reached for the wooden comb which lay on a small shelf built into the side of the loom. This comb was a flat, rectangular piece of boxwood, about the length of his forearm and the width of his palm, and it had been painstakingly notched along one long edge with a series of fine, evenly spaced teeth that matched the notches on the crossbar exactly. The teeth were the width of a sewing needle at their base and slightly wider at their tips, so that a horsehair could be guided between them and held in perfect alignment, and the whole comb had been polished to a glassy smoothness by the passage of countless thousands of hairs over its surface. The sieve maker held the comb horizontally and began the slow process of threading each hanging warp strand between two of its teeth, starting at the leftmost strand and working methodically to the right. This required a careful touch, because the teeth were close together and the hair was fine, but he used the curved awl to guide each strand into its slot, the awl's needlepoint catching the hair with a gentle, precise motion and drawing it down between the teeth until it sat snugly in the narrow gap. The comb, once all the strands were threaded, could be slid up and down the warp to separate the strands and maintain the spacing, and for the initial setup it was placed about a hand's width below the crossbar, where it hung suspended on the taut warp like a strange wooden pendant. With the comb in place, the sieve maker now turned his attention to the lower roller, where the warp strands needed to be secured and tensioned. The roller was fitted with a row of tiny iron pins along its top edge, pins that had been driven into the wood and then filed down to smooth, rounded heads that would not snag the hair, and it was to these pins that the lower ends of the warp strands would be anchored. The sieve maker gathered the loose ends of the warp strands in his left hand, drawing them together into a neat, flat bundle, and with his right hand he began to tie them in small groups to the pins, using a simple, secure hitch that could be tightened by pulling and released with a flick. He worked from the center outward, tying a group of 5 or 6 strands to the middle pin, then the next group to the pin to its right, and so on, until all the warp strands were attached and the lower roller held them in a fan-shaped array that narrowed upward to the comb and then the crossbar. The tension at this stage was slight, just enough to hold the strands straight without stretching them, and the warp now formed a vertical curtain of pale, shivering lines that moved in unison whenever the sieve maker's hand brushed against them. The critical part of the setup was the final tensioning, and for this the sieve maker rose from the stool and took hold of the iron handle that turned the lower roller. The roller was fitted with a simple ratchet mechanism, a toothed iron wheel and a springy wooden pawl that clicked softly as the roller turned, and each click represented a tiny fraction of a turn, a minute increase in the tension on the warp. The sieve maker turned the handle slowly, one click at a time, pausing after each click to observe the warp, to see how the strands responded, to feel the overall tautness with a light touch of his palm against the vertical curtain. The hairs began to lose their natural wave, straightening under the pull, and the soft shivering motion of the warp diminished until the strands hung as still as drawn lines on paper. The comb, which had been loose, now gripped the warp with a gentle, even pressure, each strand seated firmly in its slot, and the whole warp became a single, unified plane, a wall of shimmering horsehair that caught the light and broke it into 1,000 fine golden filaments. The sieve maker tested the tension in the traditional way, by reaching out and plucking a single warp strand near the center of the loom, pulling it a finger's width to the side, and then releasing it. The strand vibrated with a low, resonant hum, a note that was barely audible but which could be felt as a tiny tickle in the fingertip, and he listened to that hum, noting its pitch and its duration. A strand that was too loose would produce a dull, short thud, while one that was too tight would produce a thin, high whine that died almost instantly, and the correct tension was somewhere in between, a clear, mellow tone that sustained for a few heartbeats and then faded softly. He plucked several more strands across the width of the warp, comparing the tones, and where a strand sounded slightly flat, he gave the roller one more click, turning it by the smallest possible fraction, and then plucked again until the note matched its neighbors. This tuning of the warp was perhaps the most delicate part of the whole process, a matter of feel and hearing as much as of measurement, and the sieve maker gave it the time it needed, adjusting and rechecking until the entire warp hummed in a soft, almost imperceptible harmony. The loom, now fully strung, stood quietly in the corner, its ash frame holding the tension with a solid, patient strength, and the warp gleamed in the firelight and the day's last rays from the window, a vertical field of light waiting to be crossed by the weft. The sieve maker stepped back from the loom and surveyed his work, his hands resting on his hips. The warp threads, perhaps 300 in number, stretched from the crossbar to the roller with a uniformity that seemed almost miraculous, each one precisely parallel to its neighbors, each one separated by exactly the same tiny gap, the spacing held by the wooden comb that sat like a lintel across the whole. The hairs themselves, now under tension, displayed their individual characters more clearly than before. The pale blonde strands seemed to glow, the darker brown ones looked almost black against the light, and the occasional reddish strand that had come from a chestnut horse added a faint, warm note to the monochrome palette. A fly, which had been buzzing in the window, drifted into the room and settled for a moment on the warp, its tiny weight causing several strands to quiver, and then it flew off again, leaving the warp still and silent as before. The cottage had grown dimmer while the sieve maker worked, the sun having slipped behind the firs at the edge of the clearing and the fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep bed of glowing coals that painted the room in shades of orange and umber, the warp gleaming against the dark corner like a sheer curtain of light. The setup was complete, the loom ready for the weaving that would begin the next morning or perhaps later that same evening if the sieve maker felt the pull of the work, but for now he simply stood and let the quiet of the room settle around him. The warp waited, a patient, silent presence, and the cottage held its breath, poised at the threshold of the next slow stage in the sieve's creation. The stream murmured on outside, indifferent to the small human miracle of order that had been achieved in the corner by the hearth, and the forest, vast and dark, enclosed the clearing in its ancient, unbroken peace. The warp had been strung and tensioned, the loom stood ready in its corner, and now the weaving itself could begin, the part of the sieve maker's craft that most resembled the slow, patient accumulation of days. He rose from the stool where he had been sitting, crossed to the workbench, and took up the shuttle, a tool that had been made for him long ago by a horn worker in the valley who shaped the naturally curved horn of a ram into a slim, smooth crescent that fit the hand like a river stone. The shuttle was a pale, translucent amber color, with faint streaks of darker brown running through it, and its surface had been polished by years of use until it gleamed softly even in the dim light of the cottage. One end of the shuttle was carved into a blunt point for passing between the warp strands, while the other end had a small drilled hole through which the weft horsehair was threaded and secured with a tiny knot, and the whole tool was no longer than a man's hand and no thicker than a pencil, light enough to be held without fatigue. The sieve maker held the shuttle for a moment, feeling its familiar weight and the cool, smooth texture of the polished horn, and then he walked to the shelf where the weft basket sat, selected a single long, fine strand of the weft hair that had been sorted earlier, and threaded it through the hole in the shuttle. The strand was a warm honey color, slightly thinner than the warp hairs and with a softer, more pliable feel, and he pulled it through until a short tail remained outside the hole, then flicked a quick loop around the end to secure it so that the thread would not pull loose during the weaving. The rest of the strand hung free from the shuttle, a shimmering tail that would be drawn through the warp on the first pass, and he carried the shuttle back to the loom, settling himself on the stool before the vertical curtain of taut warp threads. The wooden batten, a thin, flat strip of beech with a beveled edge, lay across the loom's lower frame where it was always kept, and he lifted it and placed it horizontally across the warp at the level of the weaving, where it would serve to press each new weft row into place. The weaving began as it always began, with the first pass. The sieve maker lifted the shuttle in his right hand, the cool horn slipping easily between his fingers, and he brought the pointed end to the far left edge of the warp. Then he slid the shuttle carefully through the gap between the warp strands, passing it over the first strand and under the second, over the third and under the fourth, a simple over and under pattern that he executed without any need to count or think, his hands knowing the motion from 10,000 repetitions. The horn shuttle made a faint, dry scratching sound as it brushed against the horsehair, a sound like a whisper or the rustle of a bird's wing, and the warp strands shifted slightly as the shuttle passed among them, each one giving a tiny, springy shiver and then returning to stillness. When the shuttle had crossed the entire width of the warp and emerged on the far right side, he drew the weft hair through until it lay in a straight, horizontal line across the warp, not pulled tight, but just taut enough to eliminate any slack, leaving a tiny, even curve in each segment where it passed around a warp strand. Now he reached for the batten, which rested on the warp just above the newly laid weft row, and he drew it downward with a smooth, gentle motion, pressing the weft hair into place against the previous row, or in this first case, against the starting edge. The batten's beveled edge slid against the strands with a soft, rhythmic shush, and the new weft row settled snugly, the tiny curves of horsehair straightening into neat parallel segments that locked the warp and weft together into the first line of the mesh. The sieve maker paused to check the alignment, running his eye along the row to see that the spacing was even, and that no strand had been pulled askew, and finding all as it should be, he reversed the shuttle in his hand and prepared for the return pass, because the over and under pattern would now be reversed to create the woven grid. The second pass began at the right edge, the shuttle sliding under the first warp strand and over the second, a mirror image of the first pass, and again the faint scratching sound filled the quiet room as the weft hair pulled against the warp. Again the gentle draw of the strand as it was pulled through, again the rhythmic shush of the batten, pressing the new row home. And so the first 2 rows of the mesh were complete, a narrow band of tiny, perfect squares at the very bottom of the warp, each square no wider than the gap between 2 warp strands and no taller than the thickness of 2 horsehairs combined. The weaving continued, row by row, in the same unhurried rhythm. Each pass took perhaps a minute from start to finish. The lifting of the shuttle, the sliding through the warp, the drawing of the weft strand, the pressing of the batten, the brief visual check before reversing direction. The sieve maker did not count the rows, but his body kept a deep internal tally, a sense of the mesh's growth that allowed him to know when he had woven enough for a single sieve without ever stopping to measure. The mesh grew upward from the bottom of the warp, a square field of tiny openings that widened slowly, almost imperceptibly, with each new row, and as it grew the light played across it in 1,000 shifting points, the horsehair catching the glow from the window and the fire and scattering it into a fine, golden shimmer. The room was so quiet that the sound of the shuttle was the loudest thing in it, and even that was a soft, dry whisper, no louder than the flutter of a moth's wing against a lampshade. A fly that had been buzzing against the window earlier settled on the corner of the loom and stayed there, its tiny body motionless as if it too had been lulled by the rhythm, and the fire in the hearth settled deeper into its bed of coals, with a soft, occasional crinkle of cooling ash. Outside, the stream continued its endless murmur, and somewhere far off, so faint it might have been imagined, a bird called once and then was silent. The shuttle moved back and forth, a pendulum of pale horn that traced the same narrow arc across the warp for an hour, and then another, the only variation being the reversal of the over and under pattern at each edge, a tiny adjustment that the sieve maker's hands made without any conscious thought. His mind was not empty, but filled with a quiet, diffuse attention that floated over the weaving like a cloud over a still lake, noting the slight variations in the horsehair. The way this particular weft strand was a little finer than the last, requiring a fraction less tension, the way that warp strand near the center had a slight kink that he would need to pick out later, the way the light had shifted so that the mesh now cast a faint, grid-shaped shadow on the wall behind the loom. All these small observations passed through him and drifted away, leaving no trace, and the work went on, as steady as a heartbeat, as calm as the breath of a sleeping child. Occasionally, the weft strand on the shuttle would grow short, the tail of horsehair dwindling until only a few inches remained, and then the sieve maker would pause in the weaving to splice on a new strand. This splicing was a delicate task, for the join had to be as strong as the original hair and no thicker, or it would create a bump in the mesh that would be visible to the eye and unacceptable to the miller who would one day sift flour through the sieve. The sieve maker laid the shuttle down on the frame of the loom, took the short end of the old weft strand between his fingers, and selected a new strand from the basket that sat on the floor beside him. He overlapped the 2 ends by about an inch, wet them with a tiny dab of water from a cup on the windowsill, and then twisted them together between thumb and forefinger, a steady, rolling pressure that caused the natural scales of the horsehair to interlock and grip each other. When the twist was tight and the join was as thin as the original strand, he tested it with a gentle pull, and then he threaded the new strand through the shuttle and continued the weaving as if no interruption had occurred. The splice would be woven into the mesh and become invisible, lost among the hundreds of other strands, and the miller who used the sieve would never know it was there. At other times, the sieve maker would notice a tiny irregularity in the weave, a strand that had bent out of its proper alignment, or a warp hair that had developed a slight twist under the tension, and he would pause to correct it using the curved awl. The awl was kept in a small leather sheath attached to the side of the loom, and he would draw it out and use its needle point to lift the offending strand, straightening it or nudging it back into position with a touch so light that the surrounding hairs barely stirred. These corrections were minor and few, because the warp had been strung with such care and the weft hair was so uniform, but they were necessary nonetheless, a kind of quiet, ongoing maintenance that the sieve maker performed without any sense of frustration or urgency. A flawed mesh was of no use to anyone, and so the time spent making it right was not a delay but simply part of the work, absorbed into the rhythm like a pause between breaths. As the mesh grew taller, the sieve maker had to adjust the wooden comb that held the warp strands apart, sliding it upward by small degrees so that it remained just above the newly woven portion, always at the level of the next weft row to be laid. He did this with one hand while the other held the shuttle, a smooth, coordinated motion that required only a moment, the comb lifting with a soft, woody click, and then settling into a new position where it continued its patient work of keeping the warp precisely aligned. The comb had a way of humming faintly when it was tapped, a tiny tuneful vibration that lasted only a few seconds, and each time he moved it, the note sounded again, a brief, musical punctuation in the long, silent sentence of the weaving. The light in the cottage continued its slow, imperceptible journey across the room, the beam from the window sliding from the loom's left post to its right, and then beginning to fade as the sun slipped behind the firs. But the sieve maker did not stop to light a candle. He worked until the daylight was no longer sufficient to see the individual strands clearly, and then he laid the shuttle down on the frame of the loom, placed the batten across the warp, and rose from the stool. That evening he did not cover the loom or put the tools away, for he knew he would return to the weaving first thing in the morning, and the half-finished mesh would wait for him patiently through the night. The warp still holding its tension, the weft rows as straight and true as when they were laid. He ate a simple meal of bread and broth, banked the fire, and slept as the stream murmured on outside the walls. The next morning the weaving resumed exactly where it had left off, the sieve maker taking up the shuttle as if no time had passed, his hands finding their rhythm within the first few passes. The mesh now covered perhaps half the height of the warp, a square of creamy golden horsehair fabric that shimmered with a life of its own whenever a draught from the door stirred the air, and the sieve maker could begin to see the quality of the finished sieve in the uniformity of the tiny square openings, each one exactly the size of its neighbor, each one so small that a grain of wheat could not pass through, but a particle of fine flour could. He wove on through the morning, the rhythm becoming slower and more deliberate as the mesh approached its final size, because the last rows would need to match the first in tension and spacing, and any rush at this stage would create a visible unevenness that would spoil the whole piece. The shuttle passed again and again, the batten pressed again and again, and the fly that had been on the windowsill the day before was joined by a second fly, the two of them walking in slow, deliberate circles on the bubbled glass while the weaving continued behind them. At last, when the mesh had grown to a size slightly larger than the wooden rims that waited on the shelf, a size that would allow for trimming and mounting, the sieve maker wove the final row and pressed it into place with the batten, then sat back on the stool and looked at the piece he had made. The mesh hung in the loom like a tiny luminous curtain, its hundreds of tiny squares catching the light and scattering it in 1,000 directions. And the edges were as straight as if drawn with a rule, the tension so even that the whole piece quivered as a single unit when he blew softly on it. He reached for the iron shears from the workbench, returned to the loom, and carefully cut the warp strands one by one near the top crossbar, releasing the tension with a soft, sighing sound as the mesh sagged slightly and then held its shape. He cut the bottom ends from the roller and the square of woven horsehair came free, a flexible, delicate fabric that seemed too fine to have been made by hand and yet was unmistakably the work of a patient human spirit. The woven mesh was now ready to be secured between the beechwood rims, but that was a task for another hour, and the sieve maker laid the piece carefully on the workbench, where it rested in a pool of pale light, the quiet product of a quiet craft, with the woven mesh lying free on the workbench and the morning light falling across its surface in a soft, steady glow. The sieve maker turned his attention to the beechwood rims that had been waiting on their shelf since the day of the frame construction. He crossed to the rack, selected a pair of hoops that had been sanded smooth and checked for roundness, and brought them back to the bench, laying them side by side on the worn beech surface where they made a gentle hollow sound, a soft wooden note that faded quickly into the quiet of the room. The inner rim was slightly smaller in diameter than the outer rim, the two having been made as a matched set, with the inner one size to fit snugly inside the outer, while leaving just enough space for the thickness of the horsehair mesh to be trapped between them. The sieve maker lifted the inner rim and held it up to the light for a moment, turning it slowly to confirm that the joint was still tight and that no crack had developed during its weeks of waiting. And then he set it down flat on the bench, its pale circle glowing against the darker wood beneath. He then picked up the square of woven mesh, which had been resting at the corner of the bench, and carried it carefully in both hands, as if it were a fragile textile, which in a sense it was, a delicate flexible grid of hundreds of strands that could be distorted by a careless tug. The mesh was larger than the rim, extending beyond its circumference by a generous margin on all sides, and this extra material would later be trimmed away and tucked into the seam, so the sieve maker spent a long moment positioning the mesh over the inner rim, adjusting it by tiny increments until the woven pattern was centered and the excess hung evenly all around. The mesh itself was so light that it almost floated above the wood, held up by the faintest static charge in the dry air, and it shimmered and shifted as he moved it, the tiny square openings catching the light and throwing a delicate, grid-shaped shadow across the bench. When the mesh was centered to his satisfaction, the sieve maker lifted the outer rim from its resting place and held it poised above the inner rim. The two circles aligned with a precision that was the result of careful craftsmanship. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he lowered the outer rim over the mesh and the inner rim, pressing it down with his palms at two opposite sides, feeling the resistance of the horsehair as it began to be compressed between the layers of wood. The fit was intentionally tight, designed to grip the mesh firmly without the need for glue, and the outer rim could not be pressed all the way down by hand alone. It required a gentle, even force that would be applied gradually around the entire circumference to avoid distorting the frame or tearing the mesh. The sieve maker let the outer rim rest where it was for now, seated just a fraction of an inch onto the inner rim, and he reached for the small wooden wedge that hung on a hook at the edge of the bench. This wedge was a simple tool, a slim, tapered slip of boxwood that had been carved into a long, shallow triangle, no thicker than a finger at its wide end, and tapering to a thin, almost translucent edge at its tip, and its entire surface had been polished to a glassy smoothness by years of use. The wedge was used to ease the outer rim down onto the inner rim, working around the circle in small, careful increments, and the process was one that demanded patience above all else. The sieve maker inserted the thin edge of the wedge between the outer rim and the mesh where the two met, holding the wedge at a shallow angle so that it did not catch or snag the horsehair, and then he pushed it forward with a gentle, sliding pressure, the wedge acting as a ramp that guided the outer rim down by a millimeter or two at a time. The mesh gave a soft, rustling sigh as it was compressed, the horsehair strands adjusting themselves to their new, trapped position, and the outer rim emitted a series of tiny, creaking sounds as its inner surface rubbed against the mesh and the inner rim, a noise like a tree branch flexing in a slow wind. The sieve maker worked his way around the circumference in a clockwise direction, inserting the wedge at a new point just ahead of where the outer rim had already seated, pressing it down with a steady, controlled motion, and then moving on to the next point, a few inches further along the circle, where he repeated the action. Each movement of the wedge advanced the outer rim by an almost imperceptible amount, so that the whole hoop descended as a unit, its descent so slow and even that it was as if the wood was flowing downward like cold treacle. After each few inches of progress, the sieve maker paused to run his eye around the rim, checking that the gap between the outer rim and the workbench was uniform, that no part of the hoop had dipped lower than the rest or tilted out of alignment, and he tapped lightly on the high spots with the small wooden mallet, a series of soft, precise taps that sounded like a distant woodpecker knocking on a hollow trunk. The mallet's head was round and smooth, and it left no mark on the beechwood, only a faint, momentary compression that the wood's natural resilience would erase within minutes. The tapping and wedging continued for the better part of half an hour, the sieve maker traveling around the rim 3 or 4 times, each circuit pressing the outer hoop a little deeper onto its inner partner, the mesh becoming more firmly trapped with each pass. The sound of the work changed as the rim seated further. The initial creaking gave way to a lower, mellower note, a kind of woody thud that was almost musical, and the wedge encountered increasing resistance as the fit became tighter, requiring the sieve maker to use a slightly firmer pressure while still keeping the motion smooth and controlled. The horsehair mesh, now nearly fully enclosed between the two rims, could be seen as a thin, pale line just visible along the inner edge of the frame, its tiny squares still perfect and undisturbed, its tension maintained by the grip of the wood. A slight dust of beeswax, which had been rubbed onto the inner surface of the outer rim earlier to help it slide, caught the light and gave the joint a faint waxy sheen that would later be wiped away. At last the outer rim reached its final position, seated fully against the inner rim with the mesh sandwiched tightly between them, and the sieve maker ran his thumb around the entire seam, feeling for any unevenness or any place where the two hoops were not in perfect contact. The seam was nearly invisible, a hairline crack that circled the rim 3/4 of an inch from the inner edge, and the mesh extruded from that crack like a fine, even fringe, the cut ends of the warp and weft strands bristling outward in a soft, shimmering ruff. The sieve maker gave a final, gentle tap with the mallet to a section near the joint of the outer rim, where a faint ridge had persisted, and the ridge yielded, sinking into alignment with the rest of the hoop, so that the entire frame was now a single, solid unit, its two parts locked together by friction and the springy pressure of the beechwood. Now came the trimming, which was the most delicate part of the mounting process, because one wrong cut with the shears could nick the rim or pull a strand of the mesh out of alignment. The sieve maker took up the iron shears from their place on the bench, testing the action once to ensure the blades were still sharp and properly aligned, and he began the slow work of cutting away the excess mesh that extended beyond the outer edge of the rim. The shears made a soft, crunching sound as they closed on the bundled horsehair, a crisp, clean snip that was followed by the whisper of the cut strands falling away, and the sieve maker worked in small sections, holding the mesh taut with one hand while the other opened and closed the shears with a deliberate, measured rhythm. He cut close to the outer edge of the rim, but not flush, leaving about 1/8 of an inch of horsehair protruding, because this short fringe would later be tucked and sewn down to create a smooth, finished edge that would not catch on anything or shed fibers into the flower. The trimmings fell to the bench in a small pale pile, a tangle of short horsehair snippets that glimmered faintly in the light and stirred with every breath of air, and the sieve maker swept them into a small dish with the side of his hand, saving them because even these tiny offcuts had uses, perhaps for stuffing a pincushion or mixing into plaster for extra strength. With the excess mesh trimmed away, the sieve maker now turned to the final stage of the assembly, the sewing of the edge. He took the spool of linen thread from the bench, drew off a long length, and pulled it across the beeswax bowl several times until the thread was evenly coated and glistening with a faint, yellowish sheen, the wax giving it strength and smoothing down any loose fibers. He threaded the waxed line through the eye of a fine bone needle that he kept in a small wooden case, a needle that was thin and curved slightly at the tip to make it easier to stitch the tight, circular seam, and he tied a small, neat knot at the end of the thread with a single, practiced twist of his fingers. The stitching was a spiral binding that would encircle the entire rim, holding the cut ends of the mesh flat against the wood and also serving to bind the outer rim to the inner rim with an additional measure of security, a double insurance against any loosening over time. The sieve maker began at a point just beside the joint of the outer rim, inserting the needle through the fabric of the mesh just outside the wooden hoop and pushing it inward at an angle so that it emerged beneath the inner overhang of the rim, drawing the thread taut with a soft, humming zip as the waxed fiber slid through the horsehair. He then took a half-hitch stitch over the edge of the rim, looping the thread around the wood and pulling it tight, and the first stitch was complete, a tiny, precise loop that lay flat against the beech like a miniature lasso. The stitching continued in a slow, spiraling path around the rim, each stitch overlapping the previous one by a small amount, the needle piercing the mesh and emerging under the rim with a rhythm as steady as a ticking clock. The sieve maker's hands moved in a smooth, unhurried sequence, the right hand guiding the needle while the left held the rim steady and occasionally smoothed down a strand of horsehair that had lifted, and the only sounds were the whisper of the needle sliding through the mesh, the soft pop of the thread pulling tight, and the occasional tap of the bone needle against the wood when it was set down. The thread followed the slight curve of the rim naturally, the spiral stitch hugging the edge closely so that the horsehair fringe was pressed downward and secured, the cut ends tucked under the binding to form a neat, flat finish. The sieve maker paused after every few inches of stitching to check his progress, running a finger over the bound edge to feel that it was smooth and that no loops of thread had become loose or twisted, and each pause was an opportunity to look out the window at the forest, where the firs stood motionless in the still air, or to notice the way the firelight glimmered on the polished surface of the stitch, picking out the individual twists of the waxed linen. The stitching took perhaps an hour, perhaps a little more, because the rim was perhaps 2 feet around, and the stitches were tiny, each one covering only a fraction of an inch. But the time passed without any sense of hurry or impatience, the task absorbing the sieve maker's attention as fully as the weaving had done. Each stitch a small, complete act of creation that was both identical to the ones before and subtly unique. The linen thread grew shorter as he worked, and when only a few inches remained, he tied it off with a series of tiny, tight knots that he worked into the mesh with the tip of the awl, hiding them between the strands of horsehair where they would never be seen or felt. And then he cut the thread with the shears and rethreaded the needle to continue. The join between the old thread and the new was made with the same careful splicing technique used with the horsehair. The two ends overlapped and tucked under the binding so that the seam was invisible, and the stitching continued as if no break had occurred, the spiral growing slowly, inevitably, around the circumference. At last the needle returned to its starting point, the final stitch overlapping the first, and the sieve maker tied off the thread with 3 precise, minimal knots, each one tightened with the point of the awl, and then snipped close to the mesh with the shears. He ran his thumb around the entire bound edge one more time, feeling the smooth, even texture of the stitching, the way the horsehair fringe had been captured and flattened. And he found no loose ends, no rough spots, no place where the binding had lifted away from the wood. The rim was now a complete, finished object. The beechwood warm and smooth to the touch. The horsehair mesh stretched taut and perfect within its circular frame. The stitching a fine, pale line that traced the outer edge like a decorative inlay. And the whole sieve had the look of something made with a patience that bordered on devotion. The sieve maker held the finished sieve up to the light from the window, lifting it with both hands and turning it slowly so that the sun shone through the mesh, revealing the flawless uniformity of the tiny square openings. Each square was as regular as if drawn by a draftsman, the warp and weft strands crossing at perfect right angles, and the mesh had a slight, ethereal glow as the light passed through the pale horsehair, diffusing into a soft, golden haze that seemed to float just above the surface. The frame, with its 2 nested hoops and its tidy stitching, enclosed the mesh with a quiet, functional elegance, the beechwood still carrying the faint, sweet scent of the forest from which it had come, and the sieve maker held the sieve there for a long moment, turning it this way and that, watching the light play across the mesh, watching the tiny shadow grid shift and dance on the wall behind him. Then he lowered it, placed it gently on the bench, and took up the second pair of rims from the shelf, because the square of woven mesh had been large enough for several sieves, and the work would continue, as unhurried and as calm as it had been all morning, until every rim had been filled and every sieve was ready for the valley millers who would one day use them to sift their flour. The fire murmured, the stream murmured, and the cottage held its peace. On a morning when the mist clung low in the clearing, and the firs stood wrapped in veils of drifting grey, the sieve maker rose from his bed earlier than usual, stirred by the knowledge that a batch of finished sieves had accumulated on the shelf, and that the miller in the valley would be expecting a delivery before the next market day. He ate a small, unhurried meal of dark bread softened in warm broth, banked the fire so that it would hold its embers until his return, and then turned his attention to the task of packing. The sieves, perhaps a dozen in all, had been completed over the preceding weeks, each one built with the same patient care, each one a perfect circle of beechwood and horsehair mesh. And now they stood in a tidy stack on the lower shelf of the workbench, the earliest made at the bottom and the most recent on top. He lifted them one by one and inspected each a final time, holding them to the grey light from the window, running a thumb over the stitching, checking that the mesh was taut and free of any flaw that might have developed during storage, though he knew well that nothing had changed since the moment he set them down. The inspection was simply part of the rhythm, a quiet closing of the circle before the sieves left his hands. When all had been examined, he took the canvas pack down from its peg beside the door. This pack was a large, sturdy bag made of heavy linen that had been waxed with beeswax and tallow until it could shed a light rain, its seams double-stitched and its shoulder straps padded with folded wool. It opened at the top with a drawstring and a flap that folded over and tied with leather thongs, and it had carried sieves to the valley many times, so many times that the inner fabric had taken on the faint grassy scent of horsehair, and the outer fabric had faded to a soft, uneven grey from sun and weather. The sieve maker laid the pack flat on the bench and began to load the sieves, starting with the largest, which went in first to sit against the back, and then layering the smaller ones in front, each one separated from its neighbour by a thin pad of straw matting that he kept in a roll on the shelf, a cushioning material that would prevent the rims from rubbing against each other and the mesh from being snagged by a stray splinter. The pack filled gradually, the sieves nesting together like a set of wooden bowls, and when the last one had been tucked in and the straw matting had been arranged around the edges to protect the rims, he drew the drawstring tight, folded the flap over, and tied the thongs in a secure bow. He hefted the pack by its straps, testing the weight, and found it comfortable, a familiar burden that settled across his shoulders with the ease of long habit. He stepped out of the cottage into the cool, misty air, pulling the door closed behind him, but not latching it, because there was no one for miles to disturb the place, and the forest itself seemed to stand guard. The clearing was quiet except for the ever-present murmur of the stream, which sounded slightly muffled today, its voice softened by the mist that blurred the boundaries between things. He crossed the garden patch, noting with a brief glance the progress of the root vegetables and the way the rosemary had put out new pale green shoots since the last rain. And then he stepped onto the track that led out of the clearing and into the forest. The path was a narrow ribbon of packed earth, covered in places by a thin carpet of fallen fir needles that had been washed into russet-coloured drifts by recent rain, and his wooden clogs made a soft, rhythmic crushing sound as he walked, the needles crunching underfoot with a dry, papery rustle that was the only noise besides the stream and the occasional drip of water from a leaf. The forest closed around him within a few dozen paces, the mist thickening among the trunks so that the trees ahead appeared as dim grey shapes that resolved into solid firs only when he was nearly upon them. The air was cold and damp, carrying the resinous scent of the evergreens along with the earthy smell of wet moss and the faint, mineral tang of the stream, and the mist beaded on his wool cloak and on the straps of the pack, tiny droplets that caught the low light and sparkled for a moment before soaking into the fibres. He walked at a steady pace, not fast and not slow, a pace that he could maintain for hours without tiring, his feet finding the familiar irregularities of the path without any need for conscious guidance. The track descended gently at first, winding between the massive trunks of the old firs where the undergrowth was sparse and the ground was a deep springy carpet of needles, and then it steepened slightly as it approached the first switchback, a place where the path doubled back on itself to ease the descent of the hillside. Here the trees changed, the pure stands of fir giving way to a mixed woodland of beech and birch, their leaves still wet from the mist and their white bark standing out like pale columns in the dimness. The path was rockier here, small stones embedded in the earth, and the sieve maker's clogs made a different sound on the stone, a sharper clicking rhythm that echoed faintly off the trunks. He crossed the little stream that he always crossed on these journeys, the same stream that ran past his cottage, but now wider and slower, its water the colour of strong tea from the tannin of the leaves that had fallen into it. A simple bridge of 2 split logs with a handrail of woven hazel had been laid across the stream at its narrowest point, built years ago by the charcoal burners, and maintained by whoever passed, and the sieve maker stepped onto it carefully, feeling the slight spring of the logs under his weight, hearing the deeper, more resonant sound of the water as it passed beneath the bridge. The stream gurgled and splashed over a small ledge of rock just downstream, a sound that blanketed the forest in a gentle, constant wash of noise, and he paused on the bridge for a moment, looking down at the water and the way it swirled in endless repeating patterns around the stones, before continuing on his way. The path continued its descent, the mist slowly thinning as he went lower, and by the time he had walked for perhaps an hour, the grey veil had lifted enough that he could see patches of blue sky between the branches overhead and the occasional shaft of pale sunlight breaking through to illuminate a patch of moss or a cluster of ferns with an almost green. The birds, which had been silent in the thickest mist, began to call again. First a single, tentative note, and then a growing chorus of chirps and trills that filled the forest with a bright, living soundtrack. The sieve maker listened without listening, the birdsong blending into the background of his awareness, along with the rustle of leaves and the sound of his own footsteps, and he walked on in a state of quiet, diffuse attention that had no focus and no urgency. The pack on his back shifted slightly with each step, the sieves inside giving a soft, wooden creak as they rubbed against their straw padding, and this sound too became part of the rhythm of the journey, as constant as the beating of his heart. At a bend in the path where the trees fell away on one side to reveal a broad view of the valley below, the sieve maker stopped and stood still for a while, the weight of the pack resting easily on his shoulders. The valley was a wide, green basin cradled between the forested hills, its floor a patchwork of small fields and hedgerows and the occasional red-tiled roof of a farmstead, all of it hazy in the distance from the last of the mist. The river that watered the valley caught the morning light and threw it back as a glinting silver thread winding through the green, and far below, just visible as a cluster of grey stone buildings beside the river, stood the grist mill that was his destination. The mill's water wheel, even at this distance, could be seen turning slowly in the current, a dark circular shape that rotated with a patient, unending rhythm, and the faint, rhythmic creak of its machinery drifted up the hillside like a sound from a dream. The sieve maker took in the view with a calm, unhurried eye, noting the way the shadows of clouds moved across the fields, the way the smoke from the farmhouse chimneys rose in straight columns before dispersing in the breeze, and then he shifted the pack on his shoulders and continued down the winding track. The last part of the journey was the easiest, the path leveling out as it left the forest and emerged into the open country at the edge of the valley, where the trees gave way to hedgerows of hawthorn and hazel, and the ground underfoot turned from packed earth to a grassy lane that was soft and springy to walk on. The sun was now fully out, a mild, golden sun that cast long shadows and warmed the air just enough to take the chill from the morning, and the sieve maker undid the top button of his cloak as he walked, feeling the gentle breeze on his face. He passed through a gate set in a dry stone wall, the gate made of split rails that he lifted aside and then replaced, and he entered the lane that led directly to the mill, a lane bordered on one side by a field of ripening rye, and on the other by the river itself, which ran deep and slow here, its surface smooth and dark except where it broke over the weir that channeled water to the mill race. The mill building grew larger with each step, its grey stone walls and red tile roof solid and permanent against the pale morning sky, and the sound of the water wheel became louder, resolving into a complex layered noise that included the splashing of the paddles as they entered the water, the heavy groan of the axle turning in its bearings, and the rhythmic thump of the millstones grinding together inside the building. The mill yard was a broad, dusty space enclosed by a low stone wall, scattered with a few empty carts and a pile of grain sacks that waited to be filled, and the air here was thick with the smell of flour dust, a fine white powder that coated every surface and gave the whole yard a pale, ghostly appearance. The miller, a quiet man of middle years with flour in his hair and on his clothing, came out of the mill's side door when he heard the sieve maker's footsteps on the cobbles, and he raised a hand in greeting, a simple, economical gesture that conveyed welcome without any excess. The two men had known each other for many years, having done business in this same quiet way since the sieve maker first took up the craft, and their conversation was sparse, consisting of a few words about the weather, the road, and the health of the river, which was running well this season and turning the wheel without any trouble. The miller's voice was low and hoarse from a lifetime of shouting over the noise of the stones, but here in the yard, away from the grinding, the noise was muted enough that they could speak in normal tones. The sieve maker unslung his pack and set it down on a low stone bench that stood against the wall, untying the leather thongs and opening the flap to reveal the nested sieves within. The miller stepped closer and looked into the pack, and one by one the sieves were lifted out and handed to him for inspection. He held each one up to the light, turning it slowly, peering through the mesh to check the uniformity of the openings, running his thumb around the rim to feel the smoothness of the wood and the stitching, and tapping the mesh lightly with a fingernail to hear the taut musical note that indicated proper tension. His inspection was as careful as the sieve maker's own had been, for the quality of the flour that left his mill depended in part on the quality of the sieves that sifted it, and a poorly made sieve would let through bits of bran and husk that would spoil the whiteness of the finest flour. Sieve after sieve passed the miller's silent scrutiny, each one earning a small, approving nod that was the highest praise the quiet man ever gave, and when the last sieve had been examined and returned to the pack, the miller reached into a leather pouch that hung from his belt and counted out several small copper and silver coins, placing them into the sieve maker's palm with a hand that was rough and calloused from handling grain sacks. The coins were cool and heavy, worn smooth by circulation, and the sieve maker dropped them into an inner pocket of his cloak without counting them, for the price had been agreed upon years ago and had never changed. The transaction complete, the miller did something he often did at the end of a delivery. He walked over to a small storehouse attached to the side of the mill, lifted the wooden latch, and returned a moment later carrying a sack of rye flour, a coarse greyish flour with a nutty wholesome smell that rose in a little cloud when he set it down. The sack was not part of the payment, but a gift, a gesture of goodwill that the sieve maker accepted with a nod of thanks, and he tucked the small sack into his pack where the sieves had been, the flour settling into the space with a soft, powdery sigh. The two men stood for a moment longer, saying nothing, watching the turning of the great water wheel and the steady flow of the river that drove it, and then the sieve maker shouldered his pack, lighter now but for the flour, and began the long walk back up the forest path toward his cottage. The return journey was a mirror of the outward one. The same track, the same stream crossing, the same switchbacks and the same stands of fir and beech. But now the sun was higher and the mist had vanished entirely, leaving the forest washed in a clear golden light that picked out every detail of bark and leaf and moss. The birds were fully awake now, and their songs filled the woods with a cheerful, unceasing energy that the sieve maker walked through without disturbing, a silent, moving figure in a landscape of sound. He rested once at the rocky outcrop where he had paused on the way down, sitting on a boulder and shrugging the pack from his shoulders, drinking from a small flask of water he had brought, and eating a piece of dark bread while he looked out over the valley, now bright and clear under the midday sun. The mill was a tiny grey shape far below, its water wheel still turning, and the river glittered as it wound through the fields, and the whole scene was so peaceful and timeless that he might have been looking at a painting. The final climb through the deep forest was the quietest part of the day, the hour when the sun began its slow descent toward the treetops and the light took on a warmer, amber quality that slanted through the firs in long, dusty beams. The sieve maker's pace slowed slightly in response to the growing dimness, his clogs finding the path more by feel than by sight, and the forest around him grew stiller, the birds falling silent one by one as the evening approached. The stream came back into earshot, its voice a familiar guiding thread that told him he was nearly home, and at last the track opened out into the clearing, the cottage appearing between the trees with its thatched roof and its thin wisp of chimney smoke, exactly as it had looked that morning, and as it had looked every evening for more years than he could easily count. He crossed the clearing, pushed open the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the hearth fire wrapping around him like a blanket, and he set the pack down on the floor, the small sack of rye flour settling with a soft, final thump. The cottage was quiet, the fire murmuring to itself, the tools waiting on the bench, the horsehair hanging in its linen bags, and the sieve maker hung his cloak on its peg, put a fresh log on the fire, and sat down on the settle to rest his feet. The coins in his pocket a small, solid reminder of the journey completed, the long, peaceful day drawing to a close outside the window where the dusk was gathering among the firs. The dusk had settled fully over the clearing by the time the sieve maker rose from the settle, where he had been resting his feet after the long walk back from the valley, and the room around him had dimmed to a soft, shadowy grey that blurred the edges of the furniture and made the hearth fire seem brighter by contrast. The fire had burned down during his absence, but the log he had placed on it before sitting had caught well and was now a solid bed of glowing coals, with a few small lazy flames licking around its edges, casting a warm orange light that painted the walls and ceiling in shifting tones of amber and umber. The window, which all day had been a square of pale sky and forest green, was now a dark, reflective surface, in which the fire appeared as a tiny, flickering doppelganger, and beyond it, the firs had merged into a single, solid wall of blackness that pressed gently against the cottage, without any sense of threat. Like a great, calm animal breathing in the dark, he moved slowly about the room, his body still carrying the rhythm of the walk, a pleasant, heavy tiredness in his legs and shoulders that was the natural consequence of miles travelled on forest paths. He went first to the shelf near the door and took down the single tallow candle in its simple iron holder, carrying it to the hearth where he knelt, the warmth of the coals on his face, and held the wick to a glowing ember until it caught. The flame bloomed with a soft yellow sputter, then steadied into a tall, still tongue of light that illuminated the immediate area around the hearth and added its own small contribution to the scent of the room. A faint, fatty odor of rendered tallow that mingled with the wood smoke and the dry, grassy smell of the hanging horsehair. He set the candle on the stone ledge beside the fire, where it would cast its light across the settle and the small table, and then he turned to the pot that had been hanging over the embers since the morning, its contents now reduced to a thick, savory broth of root vegetables and barley that had been simmering slowly all day, the scent of it filling the cottage with a warm, earthy aroma that was as much a part of the evening ritual as the candle itself. The sieve maker lifted the lid of the pot with a hooked stick kept for the purpose, and a puff of steam rose into the air, fragrant and white, catching the candlelight and swirling for a moment before dispersing. He stirred the broth with a long-handled wooden spoon, breaking up the softened chunks of carrot and turnip, watching the barley grains swirl in the thick brown liquid. And then he ladled a generous portion into a simple earthenware bowl that he took from the shelf. The bowl was old and slightly chipped at the rim. Its glaze crackled into a fine network of tiny lines, but it held the heat well and felt solid and warm in his hands, and he carried it carefully to the small table that stood near the hearth. The table was a humble thing, no larger than a tray, its top made of a single plank of pine that had been scrubbed smooth and pale, and it held only a wooden spoon, a small folded cloth for a napkin, and the crust of dark bread he had left there that morning. He sat down on the stool that served for a dining chair, the same stool he used at the workbench, but moved here for the evening meal, and he ate slowly, spooning up the broth in small, deliberate sips and pausing between each one to feel the warmth spread through him. The bread, which had been hard in the morning, had softened somewhat in the steam of the cottage, and tore easily when he dipped it into the broth, and he chewed it with the slow, steady patience of a man who had no appointment to keep and no reason to hurry. The only sounds were the soft clink of the spoon against the bowl, the faint crackle of the fire, and the occasional creak of a timber settling in the cooling night, and the candle flame burned on without wavering, a steady, upright spear of light that reflected in miniature on the surface of the broth. When the bowl was empty, he wiped it clean with the folded cloth and set it back on the shelf, and then he attended to the small, quiet tasks that closed the day, tasks so familiar they were performed almost without thought. He took the broom of bundled birch twigs from its corner by the door and swept the floorboards around the hearth and the workbench, gathering the day's small accumulations of dust and wood shavings and stray bits of horsehair into a tidy heap, which he then swept into a wooden scoop and tossed into the fire, watching the tiny bits flare and vanish. He walked to the workbench where the tools lay in their careful arrangement, and one by one he wiped each one with a soft, clean rag, removing any residue of beeswax or horsehair oil, checking the edges of the shears for any sign of moisture that might cause rust overnight, and settling each tool back into its accustomed place with a precision that was both practical and ceremonial. The drawer plates were stacked, the awl slid into its leather sheath, the mallet placed its head down on the tiny leather pad, and the shuttles, two of them now because one was threaded with a fresh weft strand for the next weaving, were laid parallel to each other on the small shelf that jutted from the side of the bench. The work surface itself was wiped clean of the day's detritus. The small pile of horsehair trimmings swept into the scrap sack, and when the bench was as tidy as it had been at the start of the morning, the sieve maker stepped back and surveyed his work with a quiet inner satisfaction, the kind that comes not from accomplishment, but from order restored. The horsehair bags hanging from the rafters were the last items to be secured for the night. He reached up to each one, checking the drawstrings, patting the bulging linen to ensure that the hair inside was settled and would not spill if a draught stirred the bags. And then he drew a large, clean linen cloth over the whole hanging assembly, tucking the corners around the rafters and securing them with a few wooden pins that hung from loops on the cloth itself. This covering was not strictly necessary, for the horsehair was dry and the cottage was free of pests. But it was a habit he had learned from his teacher long ago, a small act of protection that guarded the hair from dust and the occasional moth, and it marked the end of the workday as clearly as the covering of the fire. Now he turned to the low bed built into the alcove in the far corner, partially hidden by its simple curtain of unbleached linen that hung from a rod of polished hazel. He drew the curtain aside and let it fall behind him, enclosing the small sleeping space in a dim, intimate quiet, and he turned down the coarse wool blanket, folding it back in a neat triangle at the foot of the mattress, which rustled with the dry, sweet sound of fresh straw. The pillow, a single plump cushion stuffed with goose feathers, was plumped and placed at the head of the bed, and the sprigs of dried lavender that had been tucked into the ticking gave off a faint, herbaceous fragrance when he pressed the pillow with his hand. The straw mattress had been freshly filled only a month before, and it still held its loft well, the stalks crackling softly as he smoothed the surface, and the whole alcove had the air of a quiet, safe harbor, a place where sleep would come without effort and without interruption. He removed his clogs and set them side by side on the floor beside the bed, their wooden soles worn to the shape of his feet, and then he removed his wool outer tunic and hung it on a peg inside the alcove, leaving him in a simple linen shirt and loose trousers that were soft from many washings. Before lying down, he walked one more time to the hearth, where the fire had settled into a deep red bed of coals that pulsed with a slow, steady breath. He took the iron poker and gently drew the coals together into a compact mound, then covered them with a layer of ash from the side of the hearth, banking the fire so that it would smoulder through the night and be easily revived in the morning with the addition of fresh kindling. The candle still burned on the ledge, but he would blow it out from the bed, and so he carried the iron holder across the room and set it on a small wooden block that served as a bedside table, the flame now casting its flickering light directly on the linen curtain and the rough plaster of the alcove wall. He lay down on the bed, the straw mattress accepting his weight with a soft, rustling sigh, and he pulled the wool blanket up to his chest, its weight a familiar comfort. The pillow cupped his head, and the scent of lavender was stronger here, mixing with the faint, distant smell of the broth and the ever-present wood smoke. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the cottage at night, the creak of a beam, the soft tick of cooling metal from the hearth, and outside, far and faint, the call of an owl that floated through the forest and reached his ears as a single, low, hollow note, repeated once and then gone, leaving a silence that was deeper than before. He leaned over and blew out the candle with a short, soft puff, and the alcove plunged into a darkness that was absolute and warm, the only light the faint orange glow of the banked coals visible through a crack in the curtain. Sleep came easily, rolling in like the mist that had filled the clearing that morning, and he sank into it without a dream, the quiet darkness holding him in its gentle, weightless embrace. The night passed as all nights passed in the cottage, slowly and silently, the forest keeping its vigil outside the walls, and the stream never ceasing its quiet, watery song. The banked coals in the hearth glowed on, a small secret ember of warmth in the deep blackness, and the horsehair hung motionless under its linen cover, waiting for the return of the light. The owl called once more in the small hours, a sound that drifted through the clearing and was absorbed by the thatch without waking the sleeper, and then even the owl fell silent, and the world was still. When the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the window, it came not as a sudden brightness, but as a slow, gradual release of the darkness, a lessening of the black to a deep charcoal, and then to a pale, silvery grey that picked out the edges of things one by one. The corner of the workbench, the curve of the settle, the outline of the loom standing patient in the corner. The birds were the first to stir, a single tentative chirp from somewhere near the clearing that was answered a few moments later by another, and then a third, until a scattered, sleepy chorus of bird calls began to stitch the quiet fabric of the dawn. The stream, which had been a constant, unnoticed presence all night, seemed louder now in the stillness, its voice clearer and more distinct, as if the water had gathered strength from the darkness. Inside the cottage, the sieve maker stirred in his alcove, the change in light filtering through his closed eyelids and drawing him gently upward from the depths of sleep into a shallow, drowsy awareness. He lay still for a time, lingering in the warmth of the blanket and the soft, rustling comfort of the straw mattress, his mind empty and peaceful, not yet engaged with the tasks of the day. The scent of lavender and old wood smoke was the first thing he noticed, then the coolness of the air on his face where it was exposed above the blanket, then the morning bird song that told him, more accurately than any clock, that the sun was just below the horizon and the forest was waking. After a few minutes he sat up, the blanket falling away, and he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet meeting the smooth, cool wood of the floorboards with a familiar, grounding touch. He sat there for another moment, running his hands over his face and through his hair, letting the last vestiges of sleep dissolve in the grey light. He rose and dressed without hurry, pulling on his wool tunic and fastening the wooden buttons with the same slow, deliberate motions he used for everything. And he stepped out of the alcove and into the main room, which was dim and cool and filled with the quiet, waiting presence of the tools and materials that defined his life. His first act of the day was to revive the fire, which he did by kneeling before the hearth and gently raking aside the ash that covered the banked coals, revealing the pulsing orange-red heart of the ember bed beneath. He laid a few dry twigs of birch on the coals, followed by a handful of straw, and he bent close and blew softly, steadily, until the twigs caught with a tiny crackling leap of flame that spread quickly to the straw and then to the small split log he placed on top. The fire rekindled itself in a matter of minutes, the flames growing from a tentative flicker to a confident, warming blaze that pushed back the chill of the night and filled the room with its familiar, flickering light. He hung the pot of broth from its adjustable hook over the renewed fire, adding a cup of water from the bucket to thin it, and then he stepped outside for a moment to breathe the sharp, cold air of the dawn and to look at the clearing as it emerged from the darkness. The mist had returned, thinner this time, a low white blanket that covered the ground and swirled around the base of the firs, but left the treetops clear to meet the pale pinkish-gold sky where the sun was just breaking over the hills. The garden patch was silvered with dew, each leaf of the carrots and turnips edged with tiny glistening droplets, and the stream was a voice in the mist, unseen but ever present, singing its one, unchanging note. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold, clean air fill his lungs, and then he turned and went back inside, closing the door softly behind him. The broth was beginning to steam when he returned to the hearth, and he ladled a small portion into the same earthenware bowl and ate it standing by the fire, the warmth of the bowl in his hands, a comfort against the lingering coolness of the morning. He broke a piece of bread into the broth and ate it slowly, watching the flames dance, listening to the birdsong that was now a full, bright chorus outside, and when the bowl was empty, he rinsed it and set it back on the shelf. The day had begun, and there was work to be done, the same work that had been done the day before, and would be done the day after, the endless, quiet cycle of the sieve craft. He walked to the workbench and stood before it, his hands resting on the worn beech surface, and he surveyed the tools that he had tidied the night before, the drawer plates stacked neatly, the shuttles waiting with their threads, the bowl of beeswax catching the first direct rays of the rising sun that now shone through the window. The light fell in its familiar pattern, a soft, golden beam that illuminated the bench and cast the faint, wavering shadow of the window's lead lattice onto the wood, and he adjusted the stool with a